Before we begin, take a long, steady breath. Let it rise like morning mist, then fall away like rain. Now, find your place, however your body wants to listen. Still, supported, free of tension. The mind often begins to race before the world even stirs. But in Zen, the dawn is seen as sacred, a window through which the pure awareness of life shines before we cover it with plans and names. Each story tonight is like that window, clear, open, unhurried. If you feel called, share what time it is where you're listening, or what you hope to see more clearly after these stories. The act of sharing connects our hearts across distance and time. Breathe once more, gently. You are exactly where you need to be. We begin our story in stillness. In a village garden, there lived a harmless snake that ate insects and kept the vegetable patch healthy. The gardener, an old man named Hideaki, appreciated the snake and would nod to it when he saw it sunning itself on stones or moving slowly through the rows of vegetables. The snake was small, no thicker than Hideaki's thumb, with gentle eyes and a pattern of brown and green scales that helped it blend with the garden soil. It had lived in the garden for several years, and Hideaki had watched it grow from a tiny hatchling to its current modest size. It was a completely harmless species, one that ate only insects and small slugs, never anything larger. The snake wanted nothing to do with humans and would quickly slither away if anyone approached too closely. But Hideaki's grandson, a boy named Kyo, who was 8 years old, was terrified of the snake. He had never been bitten, never been threatened, never had any negative encounter with it at all. But he had heard stories from other children about snakes being dangerous. His friend's older brother had told elaborate tales about venomous snakes that could kill a person with one bite. Another child had described snakes as evil creatures that attacked without warning. So every time Kyo caught a glimpse of the garden snake, he would run away screaming. His heart would race. His breath would come short and fast. His whole body would flood with terror. The sight of that small, harmless creature would send him into complete panic. Hideaki tried many times to reason with his grandson. "Kyo, this snake is harmless. See how small it is. Look at its gentle movements. It eats only insects. It helps our garden by keeping pests away. It wants nothing to do with humans. It's more afraid of you than you are of it." But Kyo wouldn't listen. His fear was too great, too consuming. The rational words his grandfather spoke couldn't penetrate the wall of terror that the very idea of the snake created in his mind. Logic had no power over the fear that gripped him. "But snakes are dangerous," Kyo would insist. "Everyone knows that. They bite people. They're scary. I don't want to go in the garden anymore." Hideaki was concerned. The boy's fear was keeping him from enjoying the garden, from helping with the vegetables, from the simple pleasure of being outdoors. The fear was limiting his life in ways that had nothing to do with actual danger. One late afternoon, Kyo was alone in the garden, sent by his mother to pick some tomatoes for dinner. He was moving carefully, nervously, constantly scanning the ground for any sign of the snake. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden path. Then he saw it. Something moving on the ground ahead of him. The shape was long and sinuous, definitely a snake. And this one was enormous, far larger than the small garden snake he had seen before. It must be a different snake, a dangerous one. The creature was at least as thick as his arm, maybe 6 or 7 feet long, moving slowly across the path. Terror seized Kyo completely. His legs locked. His breath stopped. His heart hammered so hard he could hear it in his ears. He couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare at this enormous serpent that was right in his path, blocking his way back to the house. The snake moved with a sinuous, menacing motion. Its body seemed to pulse and writhe. Kyo could see every detail of its threatening form, the dark color, the massive size, the way it seemed to be looking right at him, even though he couldn't see its head clearly. He stood there frozen, convinced he was about to be attacked, about to be bitten by this monster that had invaded his grandfather's garden. Minutes passed like hours. The snake continued its slow movement across the path, and Kyo remained paralyzed, watching it, unable to run or call for help. Finally, his grandfather came out of the house, having noticed that Kyo had been gone too long for such a simple errand. He found his grandson standing rigid with fear in the middle of the garden path, staring at the ground with eyes wide and face pale. "Kyo!" "What's wrong?" Hideaki called out, hurrying toward the boy. "A giant snake!" Kyo gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Right there! Look how huge it is! Grandfather, be careful!" Hideaki looked where his grandson was pointing. He saw the small garden snake, the same one that had lived there for years, sunning itself on the path, as it often did in the late afternoon. It was no bigger than it had ever been, perhaps 8 inches long, completely harmless. And nearby, stretching across the path in the low-angled light of the setting sun, he saw the snake's shadow. The shadow was indeed enormous, at least 6 feet long and thick, cast long and dark by the horizontal rays of the sun. The shadow looked menacing, serpentine, threatening. But it was just a shadow. Hideaki understood immediately what had happened. His grandson had seen the shadow and thought it was the snake, or thought it was a different, much larger snake. The boy's fear had locked onto the shadow and convinced him that he was seeing a genuine threat. "Kyo," Hideaki said gently, "come here. Come stand next to me." But Kyo couldn't move. "I can't. The snake is in the way. It's huge, grandfather. It's dangerous." "Trust me," Hideaki said, his voice calm and steady. "Take my hand. I promise you're safe." Slowly, with trembling steps, Kyo moved toward his grandfather, keeping his eyes on the enormous snake the entire time, certain it would strike at any moment. Hideaki took his grandson's hand and led him closer to where the small garden snake lay on the path. As they approached, something remarkable happened. The shadow shortened. The closer they got, the smaller the shadow became. By the time they stood right next to the actual snake, which quickly slithered away into the vegetables, startled by their approach, the shadow was appropriately small, no more threatening than the creature that cast it. Kyo stared at where the snake had been, then at where its shadow had stretched across the path. His breathing was still rapid, his heart still pounding, but confusion was beginning to replace terror. "The shadow," he whispered. I thought the shadow was the snake, or a different snake, a huge one." "I know," Hideaki said, kneeling down beside his grandson. Come, let me show you something. He picked up a stick from the ground, about the same size as the garden snake. In the low afternoon sun, he held it at different angles, casting its shadow on the path. When he held it close to the ground, the shadow was small. But when he held it higher, angled toward the sun, the shadow grew enormous, stretching across the entire path. "See?" Hideaki said. "Any small thing can cast a large shadow under the right conditions. The shadow tells you nothing about the actual size or danger of the thing. It just tells you about the light and the angle and your position relative to it." Kyo watched, fascinated despite his lingering fear, as his grandfather made the stick's shadow grow and shrink, made it look threatening or harmless just by changing the angle. "The snake didn't change," Hideaki continued. "It was always small and harmless. But the shadow changed based on the light, and you saw the shadow and thought it was showing you the truth about the snake. But shadows can lie. Or rather, shadows can exaggerate. They can make something small look huge, something harmless look dangerous." He set down the stick and took both of Kyo's hands. "This is what fear does, grandson. Fear is like that low sun. It casts everything in shadow, making it look bigger and more dangerous than it actually is. The snake didn't change. Your perception of it changed based on angle, light, and most importantly, based on your expectation of danger." Over the following days, Hideaki worked with Kyo to help him understand not just the snake's shadow, but the nature of fear itself. He showed him how fear distorts perception, how it takes small threats and makes them seem enormous, how it turns harmless things into monsters. They did experiments together. In the late afternoon, when the sun was low, they would put various objects on the path and observe their shadows. A small toy mouse cast a shadow that looked like a large rat. A thin branch cast a shadow that looked like a serpent. A butterfly landing on a stone cast a shadow that seemed to flutter and pulse menacingly. "Everything looks more threatening in shadow," Hideaki explained. "And fear puts everything in shadow. When you're afraid, your mind sees threats everywhere. It exaggerates the size of dangers. It interprets ambiguous things as dangerous. It casts everything in the worst possible light, just like this low sun casts everything in exaggerated shadow." Kyo was beginning to understand. "So when I'm afraid, I see shadows instead of real things." "Exactly," his grandfather said. "The fear came first, from the stories you heard, from the ideas you had about snakes being dangerous. Then, because you were already afraid, when you saw something that could be a snake, your fear made it look as threatening as possible. The shadow confirmed what you already feared. But it wasn't showing you reality, it was showing you your fear." They began a daily practice. Each afternoon, when the shadows were long, Kyo would go into the garden with his grandfather. They would look for the snake, and when they found it, they would observe both the snake and its shadow. Kyo would practice seeing them as separate things: the actual snake, small and harmless, and the shadow, which could be large or small depending on the light and angle. Slowly, over weeks, Kyo's fear began to diminish. He learned to check his first perception. When something looked threatening, he would ask himself, "Am I seeing the thing itself, or am I seeing its shadow? Am I responding to actual danger, or to fear's distortion of reality?" One day, Kyo was in the garden alone when he saw the snake. His first impulse was still fear, that instant clench of his heart, that flash of terror. But now he had tools to work with that fear. He stopped, took a breath, and looked more carefully. The snake was small, as it had always been. It was moving slowly through the lettuce, eating small insects. Its shadow in the bright midday sun was tiny and non-threatening. There was nothing here to fear. The actual snake was harmless. The shadow his fear had been casting was the real threat. Kyo didn't run. He watched the snake for several minutes, observing its gentle movements, the way it went about its business without any attention to him. He felt his fear dissolving, replaced by curiosity, and even a kind of appreciation. This creature was part of the garden's ecosystem, helpful and harmless. When he told his grandfather about this encounter, Hideaki smiled with deep satisfaction. "You've learned something that will serve you far beyond this garden," he said. "You've learned to distinguish between actual threats and the shadows that fear casts. Most of what frightens us in life is shadows, not substance." As Kyo grew older, he found this lesson applied to many areas of his life. When he was worried about starting at a new school, he recognized that his fear was casting shadows, making the unknown seem more threatening than it actually was. When he was anxious about speaking in front of his class, he understood that his imagination was creating enormous shadows of embarrassment and failure that were far larger than any actual consequence. He learned to ask himself the questions his grandfather had taught him. What is the actual thing I'm afraid of? How big is it really? And how much of what I'm seeing is the shadow cast by my own fear? Years later, when Kyo was a young man, he returned to his grandfather's garden. The old snake had long since died, but its descendants still lived there, keeping the garden healthy. Kyo could watch them without fear, even appreciate their elegant movements and their important role in the garden's balance. A neighbor's child was visiting, a little girl who was terrified of the snakes. She screamed when she saw one, just as Kyo had done years before. And Kyo found himself repeating his grandfather's lesson, showing her how the afternoon sun cast long shadows, demonstrating how fear makes small things look huge. "The shadow is not the thing," he told her, using the same words his grandfather had used with him. "Your fear shows you shadows and tells you they're real. But if you look more carefully, if you change your angle, if you step closer, you'll see the actual thing is much smaller than its shadow suggests." He showed her the small snake, harmless and gentle, and then its exaggerated shadow in the late afternoon light. He helped her understand that she had been responding to the shadow of her own fear, not to any actual danger. Hideaki, now very old, watched this teaching being passed down and felt deep satisfaction. This was wisdom that could transform a life. The understanding that fear distorts perception, that we so often respond to shadows rather than reality, that most of what terrifies us is an exaggeration created by our own minds. One evening, Hideaki and Kyo sat together in the garden as the sun set, casting long shadows across everything. "You know," Hideaki said, "I've been thinking about this teaching we've shared, about snakes and shadows. It goes even deeper than I first realized." "How so?" Kyo asked. "Well, We talk about how fear creates shadows that make things look bigger than they are. But there's another side to it. Sometimes we need to see our own shadows, the parts of ourselves we're afraid of or ashamed of. We spend so much energy trying to hide our shadows, pretending they don't exist, that we never really look at them. And anything we refuse to look at has power over us. He pointed to their own shadows, stretched long in the setting sun. Your shadow is part of you. You can't separate from it, but it's not you. It's just the outline you cast, the space you block from the light. The same is true of our inner shadows, our fears and flaws, and the parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge. They're part of us, but they're not all of us, and they only look monstrous when we refuse to look at them directly. Kyo thought about this. So, the lesson works both ways? Don't be afraid of shadows outside you because they're not as dangerous as they look. But also, don't be afraid of shadows inside you because they're just aspects of yourself, not monsters. Exactly, Hideaki said. Fear makes everything look worse than it is, whether it's a snake in the garden or a flaw in your own character. The solution is the same. Look directly at the thing itself, not at the shadow your fear is casting. When you look directly, with courage and honesty, you almost always find that the reality is more manageable than the shadow suggested. As night fell and the shadows merged into general darkness, Kyo reflected on all he had learned from one small garden snake and its shadow. The lesson had grown and deepened over the years, revealing new layers of meaning. What had started as a child's fear of a harmless creature had become a profound understanding about the nature of fear itself, about perception and reality, about how our minds create the very threats we're most afraid of. The garden snake, living its simple life among the vegetables, had been an unlikely teacher. But then Kyo had learned the best teachers often come in unexpected forms. Sometimes wisdom arrives not through grand revelations, but through small moments of noticing, through paying attention to shadows and light, through an old grandfather's patient guidance, and a child's eventual willingness to look more closely at what he feared. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what shadows you've been seeing. What fears in your life are casting exaggerated shadows, making things seem more threatening than they actually are? What worries have you been responding to as if they were huge and dangerous, when they might be quite small if you looked at them directly? Fear has a way of taking the unknown, the uncertain, the potentially difficult, and casting it in the worst possible light. Every ambiguous situation becomes threatening. Every challenge looks insurmountable. Every risk seems catastrophic. But these are shadows, distortions created by the angle of your perception and the intensity of your fear. What if you could see your fears in bright midday light instead of the exaggerated shadows of anxiety? What if you stepped closer to examine them, the way Kyo learned to approach the snake instead of running from it? You might find that the actual thing is much smaller, much less threatening than the shadow suggested. And what about the shadows within you? The parts of yourself you judge harshly, the flaws you try to hide, the aspects of your personality or your history that you're ashamed of. These cast shadows too. They look monstrous when you refuse to look at them, when you let fear tell you how terrible they are. But when you turn toward them with courage, when you examine them directly instead of avoiding them, you often find they're just human. just part of being alive. Just aspects of yourself that need acknowledgement, not judgment. Rest now in the understanding that most of what frightens you is shadow, not substance. Your fears are real, yes, but what you fear is often an exaggeration, a distortion, an illusion created by poor lighting and unfortunate angles. The actual challenges you face are manageable. The real you beneath all the shadows is capable and whole. The darkness you're afraid of is just the absence of light, and light returns with each morning. Let your fears cast their shadows if they must. You don't have to fight them or deny them. Just recognize them for what they are, shadows, not the things themselves, and know that shadows, no matter how large or dark or menacing they appear, cannot hurt you. They're just shapes in the absence of light. They have no substance. They cannot touch you. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that the monsters are shadows, and the shadows will shrink when you bring them into the light of honest attention. You are not your fears. You are not the shadows those fears cast. You are the awareness that can see both the thing and its shadow, that can distinguish between actual danger and exaggerated perception, that can step closer and discover again and again that what looked huge from a distance is quite small up close. Rest in this truth. The garden snake is just a small creature that eats insects. The shadow was just a shadow, and you are safe. You've always been safe. The threat was never as large as it looked. It never is. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale about recognition and the true nature of worth. This is the next story. There was a master calligrapher named Yukiko who had devoted her entire life to the art of beautiful writing. For 60 years, she had practiced daily, creating works that were displayed in temples and palaces throughout the land. Her characters were considered the finest of her generation. But as she grew old, her hands began to shake. The tremor was slight at first, barely noticeable, but gradually it worsened, until she could no longer create the smooth flowing lines that had been her signature. The characters she wrote became jagged, uneven, broken by the involuntary movements of her aging hands. Yukiko was devastated. Calligraphy was not just her work, it was her identity, her life's purpose. She had defined herself through her art for 60 years. Now, unable to produce the quality of work she had maintained for decades, she felt her life was over. If she couldn't create beautiful calligraphy, what was she? She stopped taking commissions. She stopped teaching students. She sat in her studio, staring at blank paper, unable to bring herself to create imperfect work. Each day felt like waiting for death, as if her life had ended, even though her body continued. One day, a young calligrapher named Kenji came to visit her. He had studied her work and wanted to meet her before she died, as he had heard she was no longer creating. "Master Yukiko," he said, bowing deeply, "please, will you show me how you create such beautiful work?" "I can't," Yukiko replied bitterly. "My hands shake. I can no longer do what I once did. My time is over." "Show me anyway," Kenji persisted. "Show me what you do now, even if it's not what you once did." Reluctantly, to satisfy this persistent young man, Yukiko took up her brush. Her hand trembled as she moved it across the paper. The line broke and wavered. The character she was forming looked nothing like the smooth, perfect characters she had created for 60 years. But Kenji was staring at it with wonder. This is extraordinary. It's broken, Yukiko said. It's everything I spent my life learning not to do. It's alive, Kenji replied. Your old work was perfect, but this has something your perfect work didn't have. It has a vulnerability. It has humanity. It shows the reality of the hand that made it, the tremor that comes with age, the imperfection that comes with being human. It's no less beautiful. It's beautiful in a different way. He pointed to specific places where the line broke. See how this break creates a pause, a breath? See how this wobble adds energy, movement. You couldn't create these effects intentionally. They come from not being able to control everything, from allowing the reality of your condition to show. Yukiko looked at her shaky calligraphy with new eyes. She had been seeing only what it wasn't: smooth, controlled, perfect. She hadn't been seeing what it was: authentic, immediate, marked by the truth of her aging body. "You're saying my shaking hands aren't ending my art?" she asked. "They're changing it." "They're revealing a new possibility," Kenji said. "You've mastered perfection. You spent 60 years learning complete control. Now you're learning something else. How to create beauty without control. How to let your limitations become part of your art rather than obstacles to it. This isn't an ending. This is a beginning." Over the following months, Yukiko began to explore what Kenji had called a beginning. She stopped trying to fight against her tremor and started working with it. She let the shakiness show, let the broken lines be part of the aesthetic. Let her aging hands tell their own truth. The work she created was unlike anything she had done before. It had a raw quality, an honesty, a profound beauty that came from acceptance rather than mastery. People who saw it were moved in ways they couldn't quite explain. It touched something in them that perfect calligraphy never had. "Your new work feels more human," one viewer said. "The perfection was impressive, but this is relatable. This shows struggle and acceptance. This shows life as it actually is, not as we wish it to be." Other aging artists heard about Yukiko's transformation and came to see her. They too had been treating their declining abilities as endings, as tragedies that marked the end of their creative lives. Yukiko showed them something different. "What you call an ending is just a transition," she told a painter whose eyesight was failing. "You've lost what you had, yes, but loss creates space for something new. If you spend all your time mourning what's gone, you'll never discover what's trying to arrive." She showed them her shaky calligraphy. "These tremors would have horrified me 5 years ago. I would have hidden this work in shame. But I've learned that every ending contains a beginning. My hand's steady control had to end before I could begin learning to create beauty from their unsteady truth." A sculptor whose arthritis had made detailed work impossible asked, "But how do you accept the loss? How do you stop grieving what you can no longer do?" "I still grieve it sometimes," Yukiko admitted. "I still miss the feeling of complete control, the satisfaction of executing exactly what I envisioned. But I've discovered something. The part of me that created perfect calligraphy was actually quite limited. It could only create what I consciously intended. Now, With my shaking hands, I create things I never could have planned. The imperfection introduces an element beyond my control, and that element often produces more interesting results than my intentions ever did. She held up a piece of her new work. See this character? I intended it to look one way. My tremor made it look another way. And the way it actually looks is more compelling than what I planned. The beginning I'm in now includes accident, chance, collaboration with my body's wisdom rather than domination of it. Kenji, who continued to visit Yukiko regularly, said, "You've become a better artist by becoming worse at control. Your mastery now includes accepting what you can't master. That's a higher skill than perfect technique ever was." Yukiko nodded. When I had complete control, I could only create versions of what I already knew. Now, with partial control, I'm discovering things I didn't know were possible. The ending of my old art was the beginning of art I couldn't have created any other way. A Zen master who collected calligraphy commissioned a piece from Yukiko. When she delivered it, with all its shaky lines and broken strokes, he hung it in his meditation hall's place of honor. "This shows the essence of Zen," he told his students. "Perfection is static, fixed, dead. This work is dynamic, alive, accepting of change and impermanence." The master's tremor isn't a flaw in the work. It's the work teaching its deepest truth. That beauty includes imperfection. The endings contain beginnings. That loss creates space for discovery. Yukiko lived another 15 years, creating what many considered her finest work during this period. Critics called her late-style revolutionary, noting how it had influenced a generation of younger artists to embrace imperfection and vulnerability in their work. When she finally died at 85, still creating tremor-marked calligraphy to the end, her students gathered to remember her. They spoke of her two periods, the 60 years of perfect control and the 15 years of acknowledged tremor. "Which period was greater?" a young student asked. An older student replied, "She was always great." But she became wise only in her second period, when she learned that endings contain beginnings. When she discovered that what you lose forces you to find what you didn't know was there. When she understood that every door that closes reveals another door you weren't seeing before. Tonight, as you rest, what endings are you mourning? What losses are you treating as pure conclusions with nothing beyond them? What abilities, relationships, or circumstances have ended that you're grieving, as if ending means death rather than transition? Every ending contains a beginning you can't see yet. The closing of one possibility opens others that couldn't have opened if the first possibility had continued. Your losses aren't just subtractions. They're also additions of space, of new potential, of directions you couldn't have gone while the old way remained available. What's ending in you right now isn't your conclusion, it's your transition. Something is completing, so something else can begin. The tremor that seems to be ruining your perfect lines is actually creating new kinds of beauty you couldn't have achieved through control alone. Rest now in acceptance of endings as beginnings in disguise. What's leaving is making room. What's breaking is revealing. What's ending is beginning, just not in ways you can recognize yet. Trust the ending. It knows what it's doing. Every conclusion contains a hidden opening, and you're moving toward it even as you mourn what's closing behind you. Sleep now in the space between ending and beginning, knowing that this space itself is fertile ground where something unexpected and beautiful is already starting to grow. In an ancient temple, there lived a cat named Tama who seemed to do nothing but sleep in the sun. While monks meditated, Tama napped. While monks worked, Tama lounged. While monks studied, Tama groomed herself lazily. To visitors, the cat appeared to be a freeloader, enjoying the temple's hospitality while contributing nothing. A new abbot arrived at the temple, a young man named Ryokan, who believed in efficiency and purpose. He was troubled by the cat's apparent uselessness. "That cat does nothing," he complained to the senior monks. "She just sleeps and eats. Why do we keep her?" The senior monks smiled but said nothing. They had learned long ago that Tama's purpose wasn't obvious to everyone immediately. Ryokan decided the cat had to earn her keep. He began assigning her duties: chase mice in the storage rooms, patrol the gardens for pests, anything productive. But Tama ignored these assignments. She continued her routine of sleeping in sunny spots, occasionally stretching, maintaining her serene presence. Frustrated, Ryokan announced his intention to find the cat a new home. "We cannot justify feeding an animal that serves no purpose." That very night, as if to prove his point, mice invaded the temple's grain storage. Ryokan rushed to wake the cat, to put her to work catching these pests. But he couldn't find her. She wasn't in any of her usual sleeping spots. Then he heard it. A soft, steady purring coming from the storage room. He opened the door and found Tama sitting perfectly still in the center of the room. She wasn't chasing mice. She wasn't even moving. She was just sitting, present, alert, purring quietly. And there were no mice in the room. Ryokan could hear them in the walls, could hear them trying to enter, but none crossed the threshold where Tama sat. Her mere presence, her calm watchfulness, was keeping them at bay. She didn't need to chase them. She didn't need to kill them. She just needed to be there. Ryokan watched for over an hour. Tama never moved, never broke her meditation. She was like a guardian statue, her presence creating a boundary that mice instinctively wouldn't cross. Finally, as dawn approached, she stood, stretched, and calmly walked out of the storage room, heading for her favorite sunny spot. The senior monks found Ryokan standing in wonder. "She does have a purpose," he said quietly. "Yes," one of the senior monks replied, "but not the purpose you imagined. You wanted her to chase and hunt. You wanted visible action, measurable productivity. But Tama's gift is presence. She protects through being, not through doing. The mice sense a predator and stay away. She doesn't have to work hard. She just has to be what she is." Another monk added, "We tried to train cats before Tama. Cats that were energetic hunters, always chasing, always catching. But they disturbed the temple's peace. They left dead mice everywhere. They were exhausting to live with. Tama protects quietly, peacefully, just by being present. Her seeming laziness is actually perfect efficiency." Ryokan bowed to the cat, who had settled into a patch of morning sun and was already falling asleep. "Forgive me, Tama. I judged your worth by my standards instead of understanding your actual purpose." From that day forward, Ryokan looked at everything in the temple differently. The old plum tree that no longer bore fruit he had planned to cut down. But the monks showed him how its branches were perfect for birds to nest in, how its shade cooled the meditation hall on summer days, how its twisted trunk was beautiful in a way that useful, productive trees never were. Its purpose wasn't production, its purpose was beauty and shelter. The ancient bell that was cracked and no longer rang clearly, he wanted to replace. But the monks explained that its imperfect tone was beloved, that its crack created a unique sound found nowhere else, and that generations of monks had learned to meditate to this particular tone. Its flaw was actually its distinction. The novice monk who seemed slow at learning, whom Ryokan had considered asking to leave, turned out to be extraordinarily patient with visitors, able to sit with grieving people for hours without becoming uncomfortable. His slowness at intellectual tasks was balanced by his gift for compassionate presence. "I've been judging everything by a narrow standard," Ryokan confessed to the senior monks. "Productivity, efficiency, obvious usefulness, but the temple isn't a business, it's an ecosystem. Everything has its place, its purpose, even if that purpose isn't immediately obvious or doesn't fit conventional measures of value." He spent hours watching Tama, learning from her. She seemed to do nothing, yet her presence maintained order. She appeared lazy, yet she was perfectly alert when needed. She looked like a burden, yet she contributed essential value. She taught that being can be as important as doing, that presence can accomplish what action cannot, that some purposes are served by appearing purposeless. One day, a wealthy donor visited the temple and was offended to see a cat sleeping on expensive cushions in the main hall. "Why do you allow this animal such privilege? She produces nothing." Ryokan smiled and told the story of Tama and the mice. "She produces protection through presence. She contributes peace through her serene being. Her value can't be measured in conventional terms, but it's real and essential. She teaches us that purpose isn't always about production or visible action. Sometimes purpose is about simply being what you are, fully and completely in the right place." The donor looked skeptical, so Ryokan continued. "You're a wealthy merchant. You measure value in terms of production, profit, and tangible results, but not everything valuable can be measured that way. How do you measure the worth of beauty, of peace, of a presence that prevents problems rather than solving them? Tama's purpose is subtle but essential. Without her, we would have chaos. With her, we have order. That she achieves this through napping rather than through frantic activity doesn't diminish her contribution." Years passed, and eventually Tama grew old and died. The monks gave her a funeral with full honors, acknowledging her years of service. They tried to find another cat to serve her function, but none could quite match her particular gift. Some cats were too aggressive, chasing everything and disturbing the peace. Others were too passive, failing to maintain the protective presence that Tama had embodied. Finally, they found a cat with Tama's quality, a calm, serene presence that protected through being rather than doing. This cat they named Tama II, and she took up residence in the sunny spots her predecessor had loved, continuing the tradition of purposeful purposelessness. Ryokan, now an old man himself, would often sit with the new Tama and remember the lessons the original had taught him. "Every being has its place in the whole," he would tell young monks, "but that place might not look like what we expect." Purpose isn't always about obvious productivity. Sometimes it's about being present, being yourself, contributing in ways that aren't measurable but are nonetheless essential. He would point to the sleeping cat. Tama teaches us not to judge too quickly, not to assess worth by narrow standards, not to dismiss what we don't immediately understand. She teaches us that the temple, like all of life, is an ecosystem where even the apparently useless serves a purpose, where presence matters as much as action, where being is as valuable as doing. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own purpose. Perhaps you've been judging yourself by standards that don't fit what you actually are. Perhaps you've been trying to be productive in ways that go against your nature. Perhaps you've been dismissing your own value because it doesn't fit conventional measures. What if your purpose, like Tama's, is partly about presence, about being what you are, where you are, contributing value that isn't always visible or measurable? What if your times of rest, of apparent inactivity, of just being present, are actually serving important purposes that busy productivity never could? You don't have to chase and hunt and constantly produce to have worth. Sometimes protection comes through peaceful presence. Sometimes order is maintained through calm being. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is rest completely, be present fully, and trust that your very existence contributes to the whole in ways you may never fully understand. Sleep now like Tama, knowing that even in sleeping, you serve a purpose. As we move deeper into the quiet teachings of Zen, we come to a story about seeing clearly and understanding true value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a village known for pottery, there lived a potter named Masao who had studied for decades under the greatest masters. He created bowls, cups, and vessels of exceptional quality, each piece perfectly formed, perfectly glazed, perfectly fired. His work was sought after by tea masters and collectors, and he took enormous pride in never releasing a flawed piece. Any pot that emerged from the kiln with even the slightest imperfection, Masao would destroy immediately. A hairline crack, an uneven glaze, a slight asymmetry, these were intolerable failures in his eyes. His studio floor was littered with shards of pieces that hadn't met his exacting standards. One day, Masao created a tea bowl for the most important commission of his life. The provincial governor had requested a ceremonial bowl for an upcoming tea gathering with the emperor. Masao worked on this bowl for weeks, preparing the clay with unusual care, forming it with absolute precision, applying the glaze with perfect evenness. When he opened the kiln after firing, his heart sank. The bowl was magnificent in form, perfect in proportion, beautiful in color. But there, running from the rim down the side, was a crack. Not a dramatic break, but a fine line that compromised the bowl's perfection. Masao's first instinct was to smash it immediately, as he did with all flawed work. But the deadline was close, and he had no time to create another bowl of this quality. He sat staring at the cracked bowl, torn between his standards and his practical needs. Finally, he decided to show it to the governor and explain the situation, offering to work day and night to create a replacement. When he presented the bowl and apologized for its flaw, the governor examined it carefully. "This crack," the governor said, tracing it with his finger. "It's interesting. It adds something to the piece. It makes it unique." "It makes it flawed," Masao protested. "A tea bowl should be perfect. This crack means the bowl could fail, could break apart entirely. it's a structural weakness. Or it's a story, the governor replied. This bowl is telling us something, that even in our most careful efforts, nature has its own say. The fire does what it will. The clay responds according to its own nature. Your perfect technique met forces beyond your control, and this crack is the conversation between them. He held the bowl up to the light. I think I'll use this bowl for the emperor's tea. A perfect bowl says nothing except, look how skilled the potter is. This bowl says something more interesting. Look how skill and accident can create something neither could create alone. Masao was unconvinced but had no choice. The governor kept the cracked bowl. On the day of the emperor's visit, Masao attended the tea ceremony, anxious about his flawed work being used in such an important context. The emperor held the bowl, examining it from every angle. He paused at the crack, running his thumb along it thoughtfully. Masao held his breath, certain his reputation was about to be destroyed. This crack, the emperor said finally, is the most honest thing in this entire ceremony. Everything else is pretending to be perfect. The precise movements, the practiced words, the carefully arranged flowers. But this bowl admits it's not perfect. It shows its vulnerability. And in doing so, it invites us to be real rather than ceremonial. He looked directly at Masao. Did you make this crack deliberately? No, Your Majesty, Masao admitted. It's a flaw. I almost destroyed the bowl because of it. Then it's a gift, the emperor replied. A deliberate crack would be pretentious, a manufactured authenticity. But this crack happened. The bowl is showing us the truth of its making, that fire and clay have their own will, that perfection is an illusion, that beauty can include what we consider flaws. After the ceremony, a renowned tea master approached Masao. That bowl is the finest piece you've ever created. But it's cracked, Masao said, still unable to accept this interpretation. Exactly, the tea master replied. Your perfect bowls are impressive but distant. They're so perfect they feel inhuman, unreal. But this bowl with its crack is approachable. It's marked by the actual process of its creation. It doesn't pretend to be more than what it is, clay and glaze and fire meeting imperfectly. He held the bowl carefully. In the tea ceremony, we value wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. Your perfect bowls violate wabi-sabi. They're trying too hard to be permanent, complete, perfect. This cracked bowl embodies wabi-sabi perfectly. It shows age before it's even been used. It admits its fragility. It's honest. Over the following weeks, Masao struggled with this new perspective. His entire career had been built on the pursuit of perfection, on the elimination of flaws. Now he was being told that his flawed bowl was his finest work precisely because of its flaw. He began to experiment. He still created bowls with his full skill and attention, but he stopped destroying pieces that emerged with cracks, asymmetries, or irregularities. He studied these flawed pieces, trying to understand what made some flaws interesting and others merely defects. He discovered something subtle. There were flaws that came from carelessness or poor technique, and these did diminish the work. But some flaws came from the honest interaction of materials and fire, and these often added something that perfect technique alone could never achieve. the cracked bowl became famous. Tea masters throughout the region requested pieces from Masao that had this quality of honest imperfection. He became known not for perfect bowls, but for bowls that told the truth of their making, that showed the conversation between intention and accident, control and surrender. "I spent 30 years trying to eliminate every flaw," Masao would tell students who came to learn from him. "I thought my job was to impose my will perfectly on clay and fire. But actually, my job is to create conditions and then allow the fire to have its say." The crack in that bowl taught me that some of what I called flaws were actually the fire's contribution to the work. I was rejecting collaboration, insisting on control. The crack showed me a better way. He would show students 2 bowls, one perfect by traditional standards, one marked by a crack or asymmetry. Which is more beautiful? The answer depends on what you value. If you value technical mastery and perfect execution, choose the perfect bowl. If you value honesty and the authentic marks of process, choose the cracked one. Neither is wrong, but I wasted decades making only one kind of bowl because I couldn't see value in the other. A young potter asked, "So should we try to make flawed pieces? Should we create cracks deliberately?" "No," Masao replied firmly. "Deliberate cracks are dishonest, just a performance of imperfection. Do your best work, use your full skill and attention, then accept what emerges, including the flaws. Some flaws you'll need to recognize as failures, results of inattention or poor technique that you can learn from. But some flaws you'll need to recognize as gifts, contributions from forces beyond your control that add something you couldn't have planned." He held up the famous cracked bowl, now aged and stained from years of use. "This bowl has served the emperor and countless tea masters. The crack never caused it to fail. Instead, the crack gave it character, made it memorable, and allowed it to teach something that perfect bowls never could. What I considered its fatal flaw was actually its finest feature." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider your own cracks, your own flaws, the things about yourself or your life that don't meet your standards of perfection. What if some of these aren't failures but features? What if what you consider your greatest weakness is actually adding something that strength alone never could? The cracked bowl served perfectly. Its flaw didn't prevent it from holding tea. It enhanced its ability to hold meaning. Your flaws might work the same way. They might not prevent you from serving your purpose. They might deepen it, make it more honest, more relatable, more real. Rest now in acceptance of your cracks. Not every imperfection is a gift, but some are. Not every flaw adds value, but some do. The question isn't whether you're perfect. You're not, and you never will be. The question is whether your imperfections are honest marks of your making, authentic results of your interaction with forces beyond your control. Those kinds of flaws don't diminish you. They complete you. The potter's cracked bowl teaches that perfection isn't always the goal. Sometimes the goal is authenticity, honesty, and the willingness to show the truth of your process, including its imperfections. Sleep now as a cracked bowl, flawed but functional, imperfect but honest, broken in ways that somehow make you more whole. In a valley between 2 mountain ranges, there was a river that confused everyone who saw it. Most rivers in the region flowed from high elevations to low, following gravity as rivers should. But this river appeared to run uphill, flowing from what looked like lower ground to higher ground, defying logic and nature. Villagers argued about the river for generations. Some said it was cursed, that supernatural forces made it run backwards. Others insisted it was an optical illusion, that the river only appeared to run uphill but actually didn't. A few claimed the river was evidence of magic in the world, proof that natural laws could be suspended. A scholar named Fumiko came to study the peculiar river. She was a woman who trusted observation over superstition, who believed that understanding came from careful study rather than easy assumptions. She spent weeks walking the river's length, taking measurements, making careful notes. What she discovered was unexpected. The river wasn't running uphill at all, though it certainly appeared to be. The optical illusion was created by the unusual topology of the valley. The way surrounding hills created a visual context that made lower ground appear higher and higher ground appear lower. When you adjusted for this visual distortion and looked at actual elevations, the river was flowing downhill as it should, following gravity perfectly. But there was a second discovery, more interesting than the first. There was a short section where the river actually did flow uphill, pushed by an underground spring with such force that it created a brief reversal of normal flow before gravity took over again. This wasn't magic or curse, it was hydrology, underground pressure overcoming gravity temporarily, a natural phenomenon that looked miraculous only because people didn't understand the forces involved. Fumiko shared her findings with the villagers, explaining the optical illusion and the underground spring. Some villagers were relieved to have the mystery explained. Others were disappointed. They had preferred the magical explanation to the scientific one. But an old farmer named Gonji said something that made Fumiko reconsider what she thought she'd discovered. "The river teaches something important," Gonji said. "It teaches that things can look completely wrong while being completely right, that what appears to violate natural laws might just be responding to forces we don't understand yet." He pointed to his fields. "I plant crops that other farmers say won't grow in this soil. They say I'm working against nature, that I should plant what everyone plants. But I've learned that this soil has properties they don't understand, that what looks like wrong farming is actually right farming for these specific conditions." Fumiko thought about this. She had explained the river's apparent backwards flow, but Gonji was suggesting something deeper, that the river taught people to question their assumptions about what's natural, what's possible, what's right. The river looked wrong, but was responding perfectly to actual conditions, both the optical conditions that made flow appear backwards and the geological conditions that briefly pushed water uphill. "You're saying the river teaches us to look deeper before judging?" Fumiko asked. "More than that," Gonji replied. "It teaches us that backwards and forwards depend on what forces you're aware of. To someone who only knows gravity, water flowing uphill is impossible, wrong, against nature. But to someone who understands underground pressure, water flowing uphill is perfectly natural, a correct response to present forces." He gestured to the river. "How many things in life look wrong because we're only seeing some of the forces involved? How many people are judged for going against the flow when they're actually responding to forces others can't see?" Over the following months, Fumiko expanded her study. She began collecting stories of things that appeared to violate natural expectations, but actually didn't. They just responded to forces that weren't immediately obvious. A tree growing bent at a strange angle because of prevailing winds that had since died down. A flower blooming in winter because of an underground hot spring. A bird flying inland before storms because it sensed pressure changes humans couldn't detect. Each example taught the same lesson. What appears wrong might be responding perfectly to reality, while what appears right might be ignorant of important forces. A young mother came to Fumiko with a problem. My son won't follow the path I've set for him. He's going backwards from where he should go, against everything natural and right. How do I make him flow the right direction? Tell me about your son, Fumiko said. The mother described a boy who refused to take over the family business, who wanted instead to become a traveling musician. It's backwards, she insisted. Children should continue family work. That's the natural flow. He's going against nature. Or he's responding to forces you're not seeing, Fumiko suggested gently. Is he talented musically? Very, but that's not the point. Talent doesn't change duty. Doesn't it? Fumiko asked. The river appears to flow backwards because of forces beneath the surface. Perhaps your son is flowing in a direction that looks backwards to you, but is actually responding to forces inside him, talents, passions, purposes that you can't see or don't value. Just because his flow doesn't match your expectations doesn't mean it's wrong. She told the mother about the river, about how it appeared to defy nature, but actually followed it perfectly when all forces were considered. Your son might be like that river. What looks like backwards rebellion might be forward movement towards something he's meant to do. The question isn't whether he's flowing the way you expected, but whether he's flowing true to himself. This conversation troubled the mother, but she began to observe her son differently. She noticed how music seemed to flow from him naturally, how he came alive when playing, how his path, though different from hers, had its own rightness to it. Eventually, though it was difficult, she accepted that his backwards path might be his right path. Word spread about Fumiko's teachings about the backwards river. People began using it as a way to reconsider their own judgments. When someone's path looked wrong, they would ask, am I seeing all the forces involved? Or am I judging based on incomplete understanding? A magistrate applied this thinking to a legal case. A man had broken a law, but when the magistrate investigated deeper, he found forces that explained the law-breaking in a way that changed the judgment entirely. The man wasn't defying order. He was responding to a greater order that the law itself hadn't anticipated. A teacher applied it to a student who learned differently from others. Instead of judging the student as backwards or wrong, the teacher looked for the forces, the different cognitive patterns, the unique intelligences that made the student's apparently backwards approach actually forward for him. Years later, Fumiko's study of the backwards river had become famous beyond the valley. She was invited to give lectures, to advise rulers, to teach scholars. But she always returned to the river itself, watching its apparently impossible flow, using it to remind herself that understanding requires humility, that what appears wrong might be right in ways she hasn't yet grasped. A visiting philosopher asked her, "But aren't some things actually wrong? Doesn't your river teaching lead to excusing everything, to saying nothing is really backwards because we just don't understand the forces?" "No," Fumiko replied carefully. "Some things are genuinely wrong. They're responding to destructive forces like cruelty or ignorance or selfishness. The river teaches discernment, not relativism. It teaches us to look for forces we might not see before judging, but after looking, we still make judgments. The difference is, our judgments are informed by deeper understanding rather than surface appearance." She pointed to the river. "This river looks backwards, but isn't. But if a farmer tried to make his irrigation flow uphill without underground spring pressure, that would be genuinely backwards, genuinely wrong. The teaching isn't that everything is right. The teaching is that apparent wrongness requires investigation before judgment. Some backwards flows are responding to forces we need to understand. Others are just backwards." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider things in your life that appear backwards or wrong. Your own path that doesn't match expectations. Other people's choices that confuse you. Circumstances that seem to violate how things should be. Before judging these as wrong, ask, what forces might I not be seeing? What underground pressures might be pushing flow in directions that look impossible, but are actually perfectly natural? The backwards river teaches humility in judgment, curiosity before conclusion, openness to forces you don't yet understand. Not everything that looks wrong is right, but some things that look wrong are responding to reality more accurately than things that look right. The only way to know is to look deeper, to consider forces beyond the obvious, to remain humble about the limits of your understanding. Rest now in acceptance of apparent backwards flows in yourself and others. Let the river run its course, responding to all the forces acting on it, both visible and hidden. Trust that what looks impossible might be possible, that what seems backwards might be forward, that nature is wiser than our quick judgments about what's natural. The river knows where it's going, even when it appears to go the wrong way. With each step on the Zen path, a new lesson unfolds. Now we turn to a story about recognition, of self, of others, and of what truly matters. Listen carefully to the next story. In a farming village, there lived a man named Ichiro, who worked a small plot of land that had been in his family for generations. The land was good, fertile and well positioned, except for one problem. Right in the middle of his best field sat an enormous stone, far too large to move. Ichiro's grandfather had farmed around it. His father had farmed around it. Now Ichiro farmed around it, losing valuable growing space to this immovable obstacle. Every planting season, he would curse the stone. Every harvest, he would calculate how much more rice he could have grown if that useless rock wasn't taking up space. Other farmers would commiserate with him. "What bad luck," they would say, "to have such a stone in your best field." Ichiro would nod bitterly, agreeing that the stone was his misfortune, a burden he had inherited and could do nothing about. One year, a severe drought struck the region. Streams dried up. Wells ran low. The sun beat down mercilessly and crops withered in the fields. Farmers watched helplessly as their year's work shriveled under the relentless heat. Ichiro was working in his field one afternoon, trying to save what plants he could with his limited water, when he noticed something. The crops growing on the north side of the large stone, in its shadow, were still green. While plants in full sun were dying, the ones protected by the stone's shade during the hottest part of the day were surviving. Ichiro sat down on the stone, really looking at it for the first time in years. This useless obstacle had just saved a portion of his crop. The shadow he had never paid attention to, the shade he had never valued, was the difference between some harvest and no harvest. As the drought continued, Ichiro began using the stone strategically. He planted his most vulnerable crops on its shaded side. He stored water containers against it, where the shade kept the water cooler. He rested against it during the hottest hours, conserving his energy in its shelter. By the end of that difficult season, Ichiro had one of the better harvests in the village. His neighbors asked him his secret, and he pointed to the stone. "That stone," they said. "But you've always cursed that stone. You've always called it useless." "I was wrong," Ichiro replied simply. "I called it useless because I was only thinking about what I wanted to use it for. I wanted the space it occupied. I wanted to plant where it stood, but the stone was never useless. I was just blind to its uses. It was providing shade, shelter, coolness. All along it had value. I just couldn't see it because I was so focused on what it prevented me from doing." A traveling monk who heard this story stayed to talk with Ichiro. "This is a profound teaching," the monk said. "We spend our lives surrounded by things we call useless, obstacles we resent, circumstances we wish were different. But often these things have value we don't recognize because we're only looking at them from one angle, in one season, for one purpose." Ichiro nodded. "I spent 20 years hating that stone, 20 years of resentment and frustration. And all that time, the stone was just being stone. It wasn't trying to hurt me. It wasn't deliberately in my way. It was just there, and it had qualities I never bothered to notice because I decided from the beginning that it was an obstacle." The monk smiled. "The stone didn't change. Your circumstances changed, which changed what you needed, which changed what you could see. In seasons of plenty, shade seems worthless. In drought, it becomes precious. The stone's value was always there. You just needed different eyes to see it." Over the following years, Ichiro's relationship with the stone completely transformed. He built a small shelter against it, where he could rest during work. Children from the village would play on it, climbing its sides. His wife would hang, washing on lines attached to it, using its height and the wind that flowed around it to dry clothes quickly. In winter, its mass absorbed sun during the day and radiated warmth in the evening. The stone that had seemed like nothing but an obstacle became the center of the farm's life. Ichiro would sit against it in the evening, feeling its sun-warmed surface against his back, and marvel at his former blindness. "I thought I knew what this stone was," he would tell visitors. "I thought it was useless, in the way, bad luck. But I was judging it by one criterion only. Could I plant rice where it stood? When the answer was no, I stopped looking. I never asked what else it might offer. I never wondered if it had value I wasn't seeing. I just decided it was worthless and carried that judgment for 20 years." A young farmer came to Ichiro for advice, complaining about his own problems. His field was too shady, too many trees, not enough open space for crops. "I'll never be successful," the young man said bitterly. "My land is wrong for farming." Ichiro took him to see the stone. "This stone was wrong for my purposes too, until the day it wasn't, until the day circumstances revealed value I had never seen. Your shady field might be wrong for rice, but what might it be right for? What grows well in shade? What animals prefer forest? What uses does shade have that open sun doesn't?" He placed his hand on the stone. "Don't spend 20 years resenting what you have, because it isn't what you wish you had. Look more carefully, change your angle, wait for different seasons. Most things have value. We just don't always have the eyes to see it, or the circumstances that reveal it." The young farmer took this teaching to heart. Instead of trying to clear his shady land for rice, he planted mushrooms, which thrived in the dim forest floor. He kept bees, which loved the diverse flowers that grew in the dappled light. He harvested medicinal herbs that required shade. Within a few years, he was more prosperous than the farmers with better land, because he had learned to work with what he had instead of resenting what he didn't have. Ichiro's stone became something of a local landmark. People would visit it, touch it, and remember to look at their own lives differently. What obstacles were they carrying resentment toward? What circumstances were they calling useless or unfortunate? What value might be present that they hadn't yet recognized? An old woman who came to see the stone told Ichiro, "I spent my whole life thinking my lack of children was a tragedy, a lack, a failure. But in my old age, I realized it gave me freedom to help many children in the village, to be a grandmother to dozens of families. What I thought was missing created space for something I never planned. Like your stone, my childlessness had value I couldn't see until I stopped judging it as purely negative." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the stones in your own field, the obstacles you resent, the circumstances you wish were different, the qualities about yourself you judge as useless or wrong. What if these things have value you haven't yet recognized? What if they're serving purposes you can't see from your current angle? You don't have to love your obstacles or pretend difficulties aren't difficult, but you might hold judgment more lightly. This thing you call useless might be providing shade you've never noticed. This quality you call a flaw might be a strength in circumstances you haven't encountered yet. This obstacle you've been cursing might be exactly what saves you in a season you can't yet imagine. Rest now in acceptance of the stones in your field. They're not going anywhere, fighting them, resenting them, wishing them away. These are just ways of suffering over what is. But looking at them freshly, wondering about hidden value, staying open to different perspectives, this is the way of peace. The stone doesn't need to move. Your eyes need to open. And in that opening, what seemed useless reveals itself as useful. What seemed like bad luck reveals itself as good fortune in disguise. There was a young man named Koji whose father had died, leaving substantial debts. The creditors came to Koji expecting him to assume responsibility for his father's obligations. Koji, believing this was his duty as the son, worked himself nearly to death trying to repay the money his father had borrowed. For 3 years, Koji labored from dawn to dusk. He took multiple jobs, spent almost nothing on himself, and sent every coin he earned to his father's creditors. His health suffered. His youth was consumed by obligation. He became bitter and resentful, angry at his father for leaving him this burden. A traveling monk named Bankei came to the town and noticed Koji's exhaustion. He asked the young man why he looked so worn. "I'm repaying my father's debts," Koji explained. "He died owing money, and as his son, the responsibility falls to me." "Did you borrow this money?" Bankei asked. "No, my father did." "Did you receive any benefit from what the money purchased?" "No, he borrowed it for his gambling and drinking." "Then why are you repaying it?" Koji looked at the monk in confusion. "Because I'm his son. Because the creditors say I must. Because it's my duty." Bankei shook his head gently. "You can choose to repay debts that aren't yours. That's your choice, but understand that you're choosing it, not that you must do it. Your father's choices were his own. His debts were his own. They died with him. The creditors may pressure you, society may tell you it's your obligation, but actually you're free. You've been carrying a burden that was never yours to carry." Koji felt anger rise in him. "So I should just abandon my father's debts? That would dishonor his memory." "Is working yourself to death to pay for his gambling honoring his memory?" Bankei asked quietly. "Or is it perpetuating the harm he caused? Your father made choices that hurt himself and others. You don't honor him by destroying yourself for those choices. You honor him by living differently, by not continuing the cycle of harm." This conversation shook something loose in Koji. He had never questioned the assumption that his father's debts were now his. Everyone had told him this was his duty, and he had accepted it without examination. He began asking questions. Legally, were his father's debts actually his responsibility? He discovered they were not. The creditors had relied on his sense of filial duty and his ignorance of his legal rights. He had been free all along, but hadn't known it. Koji stopped making payments on his father's debts. The creditors threatened and complained, but they had no legal claim on him. He used his labor now to build his own life, to recover his health, to create a future not defined by his father's mistakes. Some people in the village criticized him. "He abandoned his father's debts," they whispered. "He has no filial piety." But Bankei, before leaving town, gave Koji final words of wisdom. Carrying debts that aren't yours doesn't make you virtuous. It makes you a volunteer victim. Your father's poor choices created consequences. Those consequences were his to face, not yours to inherit. You can feel compassion for him without taking on burdens that aren't yours. You can love someone without destroying yourself for their mistakes. Years later, when Koji had built a successful life and even helped others in his community who were struggling, someone asked him, "Don't you feel guilty for not repaying your father's debts?" "No," Koji replied. "I felt guilty for years while I was killing myself trying to repay them. But the guilt was about other people's expectations, not about actual obligation. My father's debts were his own. His choices were his own. I honor his memory better by living well and helping others than I would by destroying myself for mistakes I didn't make." Tonight, what debts are you carrying that were never yours? What burdens did you inherit from parents, from past relationships, from circumstances beyond your control? What shame or obligation have you assumed just because someone told you that you must? You're allowed to put these down. You're allowed to say, "This was never mine to carry." The debts of others The mistakes of the past, the expectations of people who had no right to place them on you. None of these are truly yours, unless you choose to make them so. Rest tonight in freedom from all inherited burdens. You're responsible for your own choices, not for everyone else's. Let the dead bury the dead. Let old debts stay where they belong. You're free. As our exploration of Zen Buddhism deepens, let us listen to a story that reveals how true worth is often overlooked. Here starts the next story. In the capital city lived a tea master named Soho, who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the tea ceremony. His movements were flawless, his timing exact, his aesthetic sense refined beyond what most people could achieve in several lifetimes. Every detail of his ceremonies was considered and precise. The angle of the bowl, the temperature of the water, the moment to pass the tea, the positioning of each implement. Soho's ceremonies were legendary. People would wait years for an invitation to attend. Wealthy patrons offered fortunes to have Soho perform ceremonies for their guests. Other tea masters studied his techniques, trying to replicate his perfection. But Soho himself had grown troubled. Despite his technical mastery, despite the acclaim, he felt his ceremonies had become performances rather than genuine expressions of tea mind. He was so focused on executing each movement perfectly that he had lost connection to the spirit beneath the movements. His ceremonies were flawless, but somehow empty. On his 70th birthday, Soho decided to retire from public ceremonies. He would perform one final tea ceremony, a farewell to his long career, and then step away to live simply in a small temple. He prepared meticulously for this final ceremony. He invited only his closest students and a few respected elders who had followed his work for decades. He selected implements he had used for years, choosing each for its history and meaning. He practiced the movements daily in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, ensuring everything would be perfect. The day of the ceremony arrived. Soho entered the tea room with his usual grace, began with his usual precision. His guests watched in respectful silence, knowing they were witnessing a master's final performance. Then, midway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened. As Soho reached for the tea bowl, his hand trembled slightly, whether from age, emotion, or simple nervousness, he couldn't say. The tremor caused him to fumble the bowl. It didn't fall or break, but his grip was clumsy, his movement awkward. The flow of the ceremony was disrupted by this imperfect moment. Soho's first instinct was mortification. After 50 years of perfect execution, his final ceremony was marred by a clumsy mistake. But then something shifted in him. The mistake had broken his focus on perfection, and in that break, he suddenly felt present in a way he hadn't been during a ceremony in years. He picked up the bowl, not with perfect grace, but with simple honesty, with the actual movement of an old man holding a bowl. He continued the ceremony, but something had changed. He was no longer performing perfectly. He was just making tea, sharing tea, being present with his guests. The movements that followed weren't as technically flawless as usual, but they had a quality his perfect performances had lacked. They were real. They were Soho actually being here, making tea, connecting with his guests, rather than Soho executing a perfect reproduction of the tea master role. When the ceremony ended, there was a long silence. Then one of the elder guests spoke. That was the finest tea ceremony I have ever experienced. Soho was confused. But I made mistakes. The execution wasn't clean. The execution was finally clean, the elder replied. Clean of performance, clean of ego, clean of the need to be perfect. For the first time in decades, I saw you actually making tea rather than demonstrating how tea should be made. Your fumble was the most important moment of the ceremony. It dropped you out of performance and into presence. Another guest agreed. I've attended 6 of your ceremonies over the years. They were all technically superior to today's, but this one touched me in a way the others never did. The imperfection made it human. It made it real. It made it about tea rather than about perfection. Soho sat with this feedback for a long time. He realized that his 50-year pursuit of perfect execution had taken him away from genuine expression. He had become so skilled at performing the tea ceremony that he had forgotten how to simply make tea with presence and care. I thought mastery meant perfect execution, Soho told his students later. I thought the goal was to perform each movement so exactly that no flaw could be found. But that kind of mastery is dead. It's impressive but not alive. Today, when I fumbled and had to let go of perfection, I finally rediscovered what tea ceremony is actually about. Presence, connection, the simple act of sharing tea with other humans. He looked at his hands, still slightly trembling. These old hands that made a mistake taught me more than 50 years of perfect practice. They taught me that perfect execution becomes perfect only when you stop trying to perfect it, when you let go of performance and sink into presence. One student asked, "So should we not practice? Should we not work toward technical excellence?" "Practice," Soho replied. "Develop your technique. But don't let technique become an end in itself. Practice until the movements are natural, then let go of trying to perform them perfectly. Use your technique to support presence, not to replace it. Master the form so completely that you can forget the form and just be here, making tea." He picked up a tea bowl, holding it with the same slight tremble. "See this imperfection? This is actually perfection because it's real. It's an old man's hand actually holding a bowl. The steady, flawless grip I cultivated for decades was impressive, but it was also a kind of lie it hid my actual hand behind a perfect performance. This trembling hand is honest, and honesty is more important than perfection." In the weeks following his final ceremony, Soho began making tea in a completely different way. He still had all his technical skills, all his aesthetic sensitivity, but he used them lightly, allowing imperfection, welcoming the unexpected, staying present with what was actually happening rather than executing a mental script. He made tea for strangers, for children, for anyone who wanted to share a bowl. These weren't formal ceremonies with guests and perfect settings. They were just tea, made with care, shared with presence. And people felt more touched by these simple offerings than they had by his legendary perfect ceremonies. "You've become a greater tea master by letting go of mastery," one visitor observed. "I've become an actual tea master by letting go of the performance of mastery," Soho clarified. "I was skilled before, but I wasn't real. Now I'm both skilled and real. The skill supports the reality rather than replacing it. That's the difference." A young tea student struggling to perfect his own technique asked Soho for guidance. How do I know when my practice is good enough? When can I stop trying to perfect my movements? When perfection becomes a barrier rather than a path, Soho replied. Practice until the movements are natural and trustworthy. Then let go of trying to make them perfect and just let them be. The movement from practice to performance to presence, that's the journey. Most people stop at performance, endlessly perfecting their execution. The final step is letting go of perfection and discovering presence. He made tea for the young student, his hands moving with practiced skill, but also with slight tremors, small imperfections, human reality. See how I make tea now? I'm not performing or demonstrating, I'm just making tea. The years of practice allow me to do it well, but letting go of perfection allows me to do it truly. Both are necessary, but the second is what makes it complete. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what you've been perfecting, performing, trying to execute flawlessly. What would happen if you let your hands tremble slightly? If you allowed imperfection? If you stopped performing mastery and just did the thing itself, present and real? Perfect execution is impressive, but presence is what actually connects, what actually matters, what actually makes any practice complete. You've practiced enough, you've refined enough. Now it's time to let go of perfection and discover what's on the other side. Not sloppiness, not carelessness, but genuine presence that includes both skill and imperfection, both mastery and humanity. Rest now in this completion. Let yourself fumble slightly. Let yourself be real rather than perfect. The Tea Master's Last Cup teaches that the journey ends not in flawless execution, but in authentic presence. You've arrived, not at perfection, but at something better, yourself, skilled and real, doing what you do with care and presence, and the slight tremble of actual human hands. That's perfection. That's the completion. That's the teaching. Sleep now, no longer performing, just being. This is enough. You are enough. The perfect becomes perfect when you stop trying to perfect it. In a village rebuilding after a great earthquake, there was a master mason named Takeo who was known throughout the region for building walls that followed precise specifications. Every stone placed according to traditional methods, every measurement exact, every joint perfect. His walls were architectural achievements, admired by other masons and praised in the capital. When the earthquake struck and buildings collapsed throughout the region, everyone expected Takeo's walls to stand as a testament to proper craftsmanship. Instead, most of his carefully built walls fell. The perfect joints fractured. The precisely placed stones tumbled. All that meticulous work reduced to rubble. But there was one wall that remained standing, and it puzzled everyone. It was a wall that Takeo's apprentice, a young man named Jiro, had built in the early days of his training. The wall wasn't straight. It curved and bent in unusual ways. The stones weren't uniform or perfectly fitted. By every standard of proper masonry, the wall was wrong. Takeo had been embarrassed by it, had planned to tear it down and rebuild it properly, but had never gotten around to it. Now that the crooked, imperfect wall stood while all of Takeo's masterpieces lay in ruins. After the earthquake, people would visit that wall, marveling at how something so improperly built had survived when everything correct had fallen. Takeo was humbled and confused. He went to examine the crooked wall carefully, trying to understand what accidental wisdom it contained. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about his craft. The wall's curves and bends, which he had seen as flaws, had actually allowed it to flex during the earthquake, rather than rigidly resisting the force. The imperfect joints had given the structure some ability to shift without completely fracturing. The irregular stones had created a kind of organic stability that precise, uniform stones couldn't achieve. "I built this wall wrong," Jiro said when he and Takeo examined it together. "I was new. I didn't know the proper methods yet. I just placed stones in ways that felt stable." "You built it intuitively," Takeo replied slowly, "while I built with rigid adherence to rules. Your intuition understood something about forces and flexibility that the traditional methods don't account for. The rules made sense for normal conditions, but they weren't designed for extreme stress. Your ignorance of the rules allowed you to respond to the actual needs of the situation." An engineer from the capital came to study the surviving wall. He measured its curves, examined its composition, and tried to understand its principles. "This wall shouldn't have stood," he said finally. "By every calculation, every principle of proper construction, it should have fallen. But clearly, our principles are incomplete. This wall knows something we don't." Takeo spent months studying not just Jiro's wall, but other structures that had survived. He found a pattern. The buildings that stood weren't always the ones built most correctly. Often, they were the ones with irregular features, with imperfections that accidentally created flexibility. The traditional methods, designed over centuries for stable conditions, weren't necessarily best for extreme conditions. He began incorporating these insights into his new work. He still used traditional methods as a foundation, but he added intentional irregularities, curves instead of straight lines, flexible joints instead of rigid joints of rigid ones, and organic shapes instead of perfect geometry. Other masons criticized him. "You're violating the principles," they said. "You're building incorrectly." "I'm building for survival rather than for appearance," Takeo replied. The old principles were based on aesthetic ideals and normal conditions. "I'm building for abnormal conditions based on what actually survived when everything else fell." His new walls looked less impressive than his old ones. They weren't as straight, as precise, as aesthetically pleasing. But when another earthquake struck years later, these walls stood. The traditional walls, built by masons who still adhered to the old, correct methods, fell again. Takeo's irregular, imperfect walls flexed and bent and survived. "What's more important?" Takeo asked his critics. "Building correctly according to traditional standards, or building what actually works?" "My old walls were perfect and dead. My new walls are imperfect and alive." He trained a new generation of masons in what he called flexible building. They learned the traditional methods, but also learned when to deviate from them, when to trust intuition over rules, and when to value survival over correctness. "The crooked wall saved my life," Takeo would tell students. Not just physically, by remaining standing during the earthquake, but professionally and spiritually, by taught me that correctness isn't the same as truth. Something can be done exactly right according to established principles and still fail when conditions change. And something can be done wrong and still succeed because it responds to actual conditions rather than theoretical ideals. One student asked, So should we ignore all the traditional methods? No, Takeo replied. Learn them, understand them, but don't worship them. Rules are tools, not truths. They work until they don't. The crooked wall taught me to pay attention to what actually works, rather than what should work according to theory. Sometimes the imperfect, the irregular, the supposedly wrong thing contains wisdom that perfection misses. He would take students to see Jiro's wall, still standing decades after the earthquake that revealed its value. This wall is a better teacher than any master mason, he would say. It teaches that survival often comes from flexibility rather than rigidity, from imperfection that allows adaptation rather than perfection that allows no variation. It teaches that what's wrong by one standard might be right by a more important standard. The wall became something of a shrine. People would visit it, touch it, and remember that sometimes what appears to be failure or imperfection is actually hidden success. That correctness and effectiveness aren't always the same thing. That rules have limits, and intuition has wisdom. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the crooked walls in your life, the things you've done imperfectly, irregularly, against the rules or proper methods. Perhaps these apparent flaws are actually what allowed you to survive when others who did everything correctly fell apart. Perhaps your imperfections are flexibilities that rigid perfection lacks. You don't have to do everything correctly. You don't have to follow every rule or meet every standard. Sometimes the crooked wall stands when the straight wall falls. Sometimes your irregular, imperfect, supposedly wrong way of doing things is actually what works best for the conditions you're actually in, rather than the ideal conditions that rules assume. Rest now in acceptance of your crooked walls. They may not look perfect. They may not meet conventional standards, but they've kept you standing when straight walls would have crumbled. Your imperfections aren't failures. They're flexible, and flexibility is what allows survival when everything rigid breaks. The crooked wall knows this. Now you know it too. Continuing along the path of Zen insight, we pause now to hear a teaching about perception and hidden value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a prosperous town, there was a merchant named Isamu who seemed to have everything a person could want. He owned the largest trading company in the region. His warehouses were full of goods from distant lands. His home was filled with luxuries. His closets overflowed with fine clothing. His tables were always laden with the best food. Yet Isamu was never satisfied. When he acquired a new property, he immediately began planning how to acquire the next one. When he closed a profitable deal, he was already anxious about the next quarter's numbers. When he purchased something expensive and rare, the pleasure lasted only until he heard about something even more rare that someone else owned. He was like a man dying of thirst at a banquet, surrounded by abundance but unable to drink. A traveling monk named Shin-en arrived in town one day and took up residence at the local temple. People came to him with their problems, and he offered what wisdom he could. His reputation reached Isamu, who decided to visit, not because he thought he had a problem, but because meeting a famous monk was another item to acquire, another experience to collect. "Monk Shinen," Isamu said, bowing respectfully, "I've heard you can help people find peace. Though I must tell you, I'm quite content. I just came to hear your wisdom for my own edification." Shinen looked at Isamu carefully, at his expensive robes, his distracted eyes, the way his fingers drummed constantly against his leg. "I see," the monk said. "Would you like some tea?" "Yes, that would be fine." Shinen prepared tea, but when he poured it into Isamu's cup, he poured very little, just barely enough to wet the bottom of the cup. "More, please," Isamu said, surprised. Shinen poured another small amount. "That's not enough!" "Fill the cup." Shinen poured a bit more, but still left the cup mostly empty. "Why won't you fill my cup?" Isamu asked, irritated now. "Why won't you fill yours?" Shinen replied quietly. Isamu looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't have the teapot." "You have warehouses of goods, rooms of treasures, accounts full of money. Your life's cup is overflowing, yet you sit there telling me it's not enough, demanding more. How is this different from asking me to fill a cup that's already full?" Isamu opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He looked down at the barely filled teacup. "I'm going to tell you a story," Shinen said, setting down the teapot. "In Buddhist teaching, there are beings called hungry ghosts. They're depicted with huge, swollen bellies and tiny, narrow throats. They're always hungry because their enormous appetite can never be satisfied through their constricted throats. They're surrounded by food, but they can never eat enough to fill their vast emptiness." He poured a full cup of tea now and set it before Isamu. "You're not poor," Shinen continued. "You're not lacking in resources. But you're a hungry ghost nonetheless. You have the belly of enormous craving and the throat of acquisition that can never satisfy that craving. So no matter how much you accumulate, you remain empty." Isamu felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. He thought about the meal he'd eaten that morning. Expensive delicacies from across the sea. Had he even tasted them? He'd been thinking about a business deal the whole time, eating mechanically, barely noticing the food. "How do I stop being a hungry ghost?" he asked quietly. "By noticing that you're trying to fill an emptiness with things that cannot fill it," Shinen replied. "The emptiness isn't in your warehouses or your accounts. It's here." He touched his own chest. "You feel this hole inside you, this sense of not enough. And you think more possessions, more success, more experiences will fill it. But they can't. You're trying to solve a spiritual problem with material solutions. So I should give everything away? Become poor? No. Poverty wouldn't solve your problem either. You'd just be a hungry ghost with empty hands instead of full ones. The problem isn't what you have or don't have. It's the craving itself. It's the inability to be present and satisfied with what is." Shinen gestured to the full teacup. "Drink this. Actually drink it. Don't think about anything else. Just taste the tea." Isamu lifted the cup and drank. He tried to focus only on the experience, the warmth of the liquid, the slightly bitter taste, the subtle aroma. For perhaps 10 seconds, he was fully present with just this simple experience of drinking tea. "How was it?" Shinen asked. "It was good. Really good, actually. You've probably drunk 1,000 cups of tea. Have you tasted many of them? Or were you always thinking about something else, wanting something else, planning something else?" Isamu realized he couldn't remember the last time he had actually paid attention to something he was experiencing. He was always partly elsewhere, partly in the future he was planning, partly in the past he was analyzing, partly in the fantasy of what he didn't yet have. He was never fully here. The hungry ghost, Shinen explained, suffers not from lack of food, but from inability to digest. You suffer not from lack of good things in your life, but from inability to receive them, to be nourished by them. Every experience, every possession, every achievement passes through you without truly being absorbed, because you're already reaching for the next thing. Isamu stayed with Shinen for many hours that day, and returned many times over the following months. The monk taught him something radical: how to stop in the middle of craving and simply notice it. When you feel that sense of "I need more, I must have that, this isn't enough," Shinen instructed, stop. Don't act on the craving immediately, just feel it. Notice where it lives in your body. Notice how it thinks it knows what will satisfy you, and then notice whether this craving has ever truly been satisfied by getting what it wanted. Isamu began this practice. When he felt the urge to acquire something new, he would pause. He would notice the craving, how it felt like a kind of pain, like hunger or thirst, how it promised that satisfaction was just one more acquisition away. And he began to notice something he had never seen before. The craving was never satisfied. Every time he gave into it, every time he acquired what he thought he needed, the craving would subside for a moment, and then immediately attach to something else. He wasn't filling the emptiness. He was feeding an insatiable appetite that grew larger the more he fed it. One day, Isamu was in his warehouse, looking at shelves packed with goods. He'd been feeling the urge to acquire a rare textile from a distant province, but instead of immediately sending someone to purchase it, he paused. He looked around at what he already had, really looked. Fabrics of incredible beauty, objects of real value, things that craftspeople had poured their skill into creating. When had he last really appreciated any of them? He picked up a piece of silk, feeling its texture, noticing its quality. He had owned this for 3 years and had never really looked at it. He had bought it, stored it, and forgotten it, his attention already on the next acquisition. For the first time, he felt something that wasn't craving. It was appreciation. Gratitude even, for what was actually here. The urge to acquire the new textile didn't disappear entirely, but it loosened its grip. Maybe he didn't need it. Maybe what he already had was enough. Years passed. Isamu remained a successful merchant, but his relationship with his success changed completely. He still worked, still traded, still earned money, but the desperate quality was gone. He could enjoy what he had, instead of always straining toward what he didn't have. When Shinen prepared to leave town, continuing his travels, Isamu came to say goodbye. "Thank you," Isamu said, bowing deeply. "You taught me how to not be a hungry ghost." "I taught you nothing," Shinen replied. "You already had everything you needed. You just weren't present enough to receive it. The hungry ghost doesn't lack food. He lacks the ability to taste what's in his mouth because he's already thinking about the next bite. You learned to actually taste your life. That's all." He smiled and placed a hand on Isamu's shoulder. "The irony is that now, with less craving, you probably enjoy your wealth more than when you were desperately accumulating it. Satisfaction doesn't come from having everything. It comes from being present to what you have. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, you might notice your own hungry ghost. The part of you that always wants more, that's never quite satisfied, that's already thinking about tomorrow instead of receiving today. What if, just for these hours of rest, you allowed yourself to be satisfied? What if nothing needed to be added, improved, or changed? What if this moment, exactly as it is, was enough? The craving promises that satisfaction is just ahead, just out of reach. One more thing, one more achievement, one more experience. But that satisfaction never arrives, because craving itself is the obstacle to satisfaction. Let yourself rest in enoughness tonight. You have enough. You are enough. This moment is enough. The hungry ghost can rest now. Let satisfaction come not from adding more, but from finally, fully receiving what's already here. As we drift deeper into the still waters of Zen, a quiet teaching begins to rise, one that speaks of clarity and of value not always seen. Listen gently now. The next story begins. In a garden temple, the monks kept a beautiful crane named Haku in a large bamboo enclosure. Haku had been brought to the temple as an injured chick, nursed back to health, and raised in the enclosure where he was safe from predators and provided with ample food. For 3 years, Haku lived comfortably in his bamboo home. The monks fed him daily, cleaned his space, and even spoke to him in gentle tones. He had everything a crane could need except freedom, though the monks assured themselves they were keeping him safe. One day, a traveling priest named Osho visited the temple and saw Haku in his enclosure. The priest noticed that Haku's wings had grown strong and full. He was clearly capable of flight, yet he never attempted to fly beyond the bamboo walls, even though portions of the enclosure were open to the sky. "Why doesn't your crane fly away?" Osho asked the monks. "He could if he wanted to," one monk replied. "We don't clip his wings." "But he stays because he knows this is where his food comes, where he's safe, where he belongs." Osho watched Haku for several days. The crane would walk around his enclosure, occasionally stretching his wings, but never attempting actual flight. It was as if Haku had forgotten that flight was even possible, that his wings had any purpose beyond stretching. On his last day at the temple, Osho asked permission to enter Haku's enclosure. He approached the crane slowly, then suddenly clapped his hands and shouted, startling Haku into the air. The crane's wings opened instinctively, and for a moment, Haku was flying, truly flying, circling above the enclosure in surprise. But after only 2 circles, Haku landed back in his familiar corner, as if the brief flight had frightened rather than thrilled him. He settled back into his routine immediately, walking the same worn paths he always walked. The monks were angry. "You scared him! You could have hurt him!" "I showed him he could fly," Osho replied calmly, "but he chose to land." That choice tells me something important. Your crane is imprisoned not by bamboo walls, but by comfort. He could leave any time, but he won't, because the enclosure has become more familiar than freedom. He looked at the monks gathered around him. And before you judge Haku too harshly, ask yourselves, how are you different? How many of you are living in comfortable enclosures of your own making, never attempting to fly because the familiar is safer than the possible? One young monk, named Botan, was particularly struck by this question. He realized he had been at the temple for 5 years, had taken preliminary vows, but had never fully committed to the monastic life. He was comfortable in this in-between state, receiving the structure and security of monastery life without the full commitment it demanded. Like Haku, he had wings he never used. After Osho left, Botan couldn't stop thinking about the crane. He began to see Haku differently, not as a bird being kept safe, but as a bird being kept comfortable in a cage he could leave any time. And he began to see himself the same way. He started paying attention to all the ways the monastery had become his comfortable enclosure. He knew when every meal would come. He knew exactly what each day would bring. He had routines that felt safe, relationships that felt predictable, a life that felt controlled. And he realized this comfort was preventing him from attempting the flight that monastic life was actually meant to enable. The leap into full commitment, into genuine spiritual practice, into the risk and uncertainty that real transformation requires. "I've been living like Haku," Botan confessed to the abbot. "Safe and comfortable, but not really alive. Not really practicing, just walking the same familiar paths day after day." The abbot, who'd been troubled by Osho's words about the crane, nodded. "You're not alone." Many of us have made the monastery into a comfortable cage rather than a launching place. We've mistaken security for wisdom, routine for practice, comfort for peace. He gestured toward Haku's enclosure. The priest was right to startle the crane into flight, not to frighten him, but to remind him what his wings were for. Perhaps we all need to be startled sometimes, reminded that we have wings we're not using, capabilities we're not exercising, flights we're not attempting, because the ground feels safer. The monks began to look at their own lives with new eyes. They noticed patterns of comfortable avoidance, ways they stayed safely within self-imposed limits, flights they could attempt but didn't. The monastery, meant to be a place of transformation, had become for many a place of comfortable stagnation. Gradually, changes began to happen. Monks who had been avoiding difficult practices began to attempt them. Commitments that had been postponed were made. Risks that had seemed too frightening were taken. Not everyone changed. Some preferred the comfortable enclosure, but many discovered they had wings they had forgotten about. As for Haku, the monks began to encourage him to fly, taking him to open areas and gently startling him into the air. At first, he would fly only briefly before landing back in familiar territory, but eventually, his flights grew longer. One day, Haku flew beyond the temple grounds entirely and didn't return. The monks felt both loss and joy. They had loved having Haku, but they recognized that keeping him comfortable had been keeping him caged. Setting him free, truly free, not just free within limits, was the compassionate thing, even though it meant losing him. Botan, watching Haku disappear into the distance, felt inspired. If a crane can remember how to fly after 3 years of comfortable captivity, then surely I can remember what I came here to do. I've been in my bamboo enclosure long enough. He took his final vows that week, fully committing to monastic life. It was terrifying in a way his comfortable half-commitment had never been. But it was also exhilarating, like stretching wings he had forgotten he possessed. Years later, when Botan had become a teacher, he would often tell the story of Haku the crane. "We all build comfortable enclosures," he would say. "Relationships that feel safe but limit growth. Jobs that provide security but prevent exploration. Routines that feel comforting but cage us. The bamboo walls look like protection, but they're actually prevention, preventing us from discovering what we're capable of, from attempting flights we were made for. Students would ask, but how do we know when comfort has become a cage? When should we leave the enclosure? When you're walking the same paths day after day without growth, Botan would reply. When you've stopped even looking at the sky. When you've forgotten you have wings. When the thought of flying fills you with fear rather than excitement. These are signs that comfort has become captivity, that the safe enclosure has become a prison you don't recognize as a prison because it's comfortable. He would pause, then add, the tragedy isn't being in the enclosure. The tragedy is forgetting you can leave, forgetting you were made for flight, forgetting that your wings have purpose beyond stretching. Haku lived 3 years in comfortable captivity before someone reminded him he could fly. How many years will you live in yours before you remember? Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own bamboo enclosure. What comfortable cage have you built for yourself? What safe patterns have you established that prevent growth? What flights are you not attempting because staying grounded feels safer? You have wings. You've always had wings. The question isn't whether you're capable of flight. You are. The question is whether you've become so comfortable with the ground that you've forgotten that the sky is where you belong. Whether the bamboo enclosure feels so safe that you've stopped noticing it's still an enclosure. Rest tonight with this awareness. Tomorrow, you could fly. You could attempt something that terrifies you. You could leave the comfortable patterns and risk the unknown. You could stretch your wings, not just as exercise, but as preparation for actual flight. The cage isn't locked. It never was. You've just been comfortable enough that you forgot to try the door. Sleep now and dream of flying. Let some part of you remember what your wings are for. And when you wake, maybe, just maybe, you'll be ready to find out what happens when you actually use them. At the edge of a village stood a house whose small garden received almost no direct sunlight. Tall buildings on either side cast shadows that leave the garden in shade for all but an hour each day. The previous owners had tried repeatedly to grow sun-loving flowers and vegetables, but everything either died or grew weak and spindly, stretching desperately toward the brief sliver of light. When Yuki moved into the house, neighbors warned her about the garden. Nothing grows there, they said. The shade is too deep. Better to pave it over and use it for storage. But Yuki looked at the shaded space differently. It's not that nothing can grow here, she said. It's that sun-loving plants can't grow here. The garden isn't bad. It's just suited for different things than the previous owners were trying to grow. She began researching plants that thrived in shade, ferns that loved the dim moisture, hostas with broad leaves that caught what little light appeared, shade-loving flowers that bloomed in muted colors, but with delicate beauty. Instead of fighting the garden's nature, she worked with it. Within a year, Yuki's shaded garden was lush and beautiful. It didn't look like sunny gardens with their bright flowers and robust vegetables. It had a different aesthetic, subtle, cool, mysterious. The greens were deeper, the flowers were more delicate. The whole space had a quality of quiet richness that sun-blasted gardens never achieved. Neighbors who had declared the space hopeless came to see what Yuki had created. They were amazed, though some were still dismissive. "It's pretty," one neighbor said, "but it's not a real garden. Real gardens have tomatoes and sunflowers and bright colors. Your garden is just making the best of bad conditions." "Are its conditions bad?" Yuki asked. "Or just different conditions?" "These ferns and hostas are barely surviving. They're thriving. They're doing exactly what they evolved to do in exactly the kind of environment they need. The previous owners failed because they tried to grow sun plants in shade. I'm succeeding because I'm growing shade plants in shade." She touched a particularly lush fern. "This plant would die in full sun. It needs shade. For this fern, my garden isn't difficult conditions, it's ideal conditions. The mistake is measuring all gardens by sun garden standards and calling everything else deficient." A young woman named Hannah, who lived nearby, was struck by this perspective. Hannah had always felt like she was growing in the shade in difficult circumstances that made the kind of success others achieved impossible for her. She had health issues that limited her energy. She lived in poverty, which restricted her opportunities. She lacked the family support that others took for granted. Everyone told her she needed to overcome these limitations, to find more light, to transform her difficult conditions into easier ones. But what if, like Yuki's garden, she just needed to stop trying to grow like a sun plant and instead discover how to thrive as a shade plant? She came to talk with Yuki about this idea. "I feel like I'm always failing," Hana admitted, "because I can't achieve what healthy, wealthy people with family support achieve. I'm trying to grow tomatoes in shade, basically. But I don't know what the equivalent of shade plants would be for a human life." Yuki walked her through the garden, explaining her choices. "See how I chose plants that need less energy? That's like you choosing work that fits your energy levels rather than jobs that demand more than you can give. See how I selected plants that thrive in cool, moist conditions? That's like you finding strengths that develop specifically because of your limitations, not despite them." She pointed to a particularly beautiful shade flower. "This would never survive in full sun. Its delicate petals would burn. But here, protected from harsh light, it blooms with a beauty that sun lovers can't achieve." Your limitations might protect you from certain kinds of harm while allowing you to develop qualities that people in easier conditions never develop. Hana began to reconsider her entire life. What if she stopped measuring herself by sun garden standards? What if she found shade garden ways to thrive? She had deep empathy, probably developed through her own suffering. She had patience, learned through chronic illness. She had creativity in making do with little, born from poverty. These weren't consolation prizes for failing at normal success. These were actual strengths, shade plant qualities that were valuable in themselves. She started making different choices. She took a job that paid less, but required less energy, allowing her to work sustainably rather than constantly burning out. She developed friendships with others who lived in shade, creating community with people who understood difficult circumstances. She stopped apologizing for needing things that others didn't need, recognizing that shade plants legitimately need different care than sun plants. Word spread about Yuki's garden and the perspective it represented. People who felt they were growing in difficult conditions began to see themselves differently. A man with learning disabilities stopped trying to compete in academic environments and found work that used his practical intelligence. A woman with anxiety stopped forcing herself into high-stress social situations and built a life that honored her need for quiet. A family with limited income stopped feeling inadequate for not achieving wealth and found richness in their strong relationships. The shade garden teaching, as people began to call it, spread beyond individuals to organizations. A school started creating shade garden programs for students who couldn't thrive in standard classroom environments. A business developed positions specifically designed for people with limitations that made traditional jobs difficult. A community center created spaces for people who needed accommodations that mainstream spaces didn't provide. Not everyone appreciated this perspective. Some critics said it encouraged people to accept limitations rather than overcoming them. You're telling people to give up, they argued, to accept that they can't thrive in normal conditions rather than working to change their circumstances. Yuki would answer these critics by walking them through her garden. Look at these plants. Should they be working to become sun plants? Should they be trying to overcome their shade-thriving nature? Or should they be celebrated for being excellent at what they actually are? She would point to a struggling plant that needed more light. Sometimes you do need to change conditions. This plant is genuinely in the wrong place. It needs to be moved to a more light-filled place. But most of these plants, they're exactly where they should be, thriving in conditions that sun plants would call impossible. The question isn't whether to overcome all limitations. The question is whether your limitations are like shade for a shade plant, the right conditions for your actual nature, or like shade for a sun plant, wrong conditions that need to change. A teacher named Nobuo applied this to his classroom. He stopped trying to make all students thrive in the same way. He recognized that some students were sun plants who needed bright, fast-paced, competitive environments. Others were shade plants that needed quiet, slow, supportive conditions. Trying to make shade plant students compete in sun plant ways was as futile as trying to grow ferns in full sun. He created different pathways through his curriculum, different ways to demonstrate learning, and different environments within his classroom. And he found that students he had previously considered struggling were actually thriving. They just needed shade garden conditions to show what they could do. Years later, Yuki's garden became something of a pilgrimage site for people living in difficult circumstances. They would come to see that lushness was possible even in shade, that beauty didn't require ideal conditions, that thriving could look different from what sunny gardens showed. Yuki, now elderly, would sit in her garden talking with visitors. The hardest thing, she would tell them, is stopping comparing yourself to sun gardens. Stop measuring your lushness by their standards. Stop trying to be bright when your beauty is subtle. Once you accept that you're a shade garden, once you stop apologizing for it and start working with it, you discover possibilities you never knew existed. She would touch the ferns and hostas she had planted decades earlier, now mature and magnificent. These plants are barely surviving in bad conditions. They're thriving in ideal conditions for their nature. The shade isn't their obstacle, it's their element. And the same might be true for you. Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider the shade you're growing in. The difficult conditions you've been taught to see as obstacles might actually be the right environment for who you actually are. Not who you think you should be, not who sun gardens demand, but who you actually are. Stop trying to grow sun plants in shade. Stop measuring yourself by standards designed for different conditions. Start asking, what does thriving look like for a shade plant? What can I grow that loves these exact conditions? What beauty can emerge specifically because of these limitations, not despite them? Rest now in your shade garden. Let yourself be a fern, a hosta, a delicate shade flower. Stop burning yourself trying to bloom in full sun. Sink into the cool moisture of your actual conditions and discover what wants to grow there. Shade isn't a deficiency. It's just a different light. And different light creates different beauty. Trust that yours is worth growing. With each breath, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen, where the smallest stone may hold the greatest truth. Here starts the next story. In a village known throughout the region for its ceramics, there lived a potter named Fumiko, who had inherited her father's workshop and his reputation for perfection. Her father had been famous for creating bowls so symmetrical, so flawless, that wealthy merchants would travel for days to purchase them. Every curve was exact. Every glaze was even. Every piece was a testament to complete control over the materials and process. Fumiko had learned her father's techniques perfectly. She could throw a bowl on the wheel with such precision that it seemed made by compass and ruler rather than human hands. She could apply glazes so evenly that no variation of color disturbed the surface. Her work was impeccable, and her success reflected that. Orders came from nobles and temples. Her workshop prospered. But Fumiko herself was miserable. Each piece she created felt lifeless to her, though she couldn't explain why. They were beautiful, yes, perfect, certainly. But holding one of her bowls felt like holding a cold stone. There was no warmth in them, no personality, no soul. They were technically masterful, but somehow empty. She tried to push these feelings away. After all, people praised her work constantly. They paid premium prices. They displayed her bowls in places of honor. Who was she to feel dissatisfied when she had achieved everything her father had taught her to achieve? One autumn, a traveling monk stopped at Fumiko's workshop. He was old, his robes worn but clean, his face weathered by years of walking mountain paths. He asked if he might trade a blessing for a simple bowl to carry his daily rice. Fumiko, who gave generously to monks, brought out one of her perfect bowls. "Please, take this. It's my gift." The monk held it, turning it slowly in his hands. His face was unreadable. "Is something wrong?" Fumiko asked. "It's very beautiful," the monk said carefully. "Very perfect." But where is the potter in this bowl? I see perfection, but I don't see you. Fumiko felt something crack open inside her chest. This stranger had spoken aloud the very thing she had been feeling, but couldn't name. "I don't understand," she said. Though she did. She absolutely did. The monk set down the perfect bowl and pulled from his bag an old tea bowl he carried. It was rough, clearly handmade, with an uneven rim and a glaze that had run in unexpected ways during firing. There was a spot where the potter's thumb had pressed into the soft clay, leaving a permanent impression. The bowl was crooked, sitting unevenly when placed on the table. "This bowl," the monk said, "was made by a potter who had nothing to prove. Look here. He pointed to the thumbprint. I can see the exact moment when the clay was soft and the potter was human, and the two touched. This bowl tells me a story. It speaks of someone who was fully present while making it, not worried about perfection, just engaged with clay and water and fire. He lifted it to his lips, pretending to drink. When I use this bowl, I'm touching that potter's humanity. The imperfection is not a flaw. It's a signature. It's proof that a real person, with real hands, in a real moment, made this thing. He looked at Fumiko's perfect bowl again. Your bowl could have been made by a machine. It reveals nothing of you. It hides you behind perfect technique. It's beautiful, but it's also lonely. The monk thanked Fumiko for her generosity and continued on his way, taking her perfect bowl with him. But his words stayed in her workshop like smoke, impossible to ignore. That evening, Fumiko sat at her wheel with a fresh ball of clay. She began to throw a bowl, but this time she did something different. When her hand slipped slightly, creating a small wobble in the rim, she didn't smooth it away. She left it. When a bit of glaze dripped unevenly during application, she let it drip. When her thumb pressed too hard in one spot, leaving an impression, she allowed it to remain. Every instinct she had, every lesson from her father, screamed at her to fix these flaws. But she resisted. She let the bowl be what it wanted to be, imperfect and honest and human. When it came out of the kiln, Fumiko held it with trembling hands. It was crooked. One side was slightly higher than the other. The glaze was uneven, darker in some places, lighter in others. There was a clear thumbprint in the clay and a small crack that had formed during firing but hadn't broken all the way through. By every standard she had been taught, this bowl was a failure. But as she held it, turning it slowly in the light, she felt something she had never felt holding her perfect bowls. She felt moved. This bowl had a presence. It spoke of the afternoon she had made it, the way the light had come through the window, the mood she had been in, the questions turning in her mind. It was unique in all the world. Every other bowl she had ever made could be reproduced, but this one, with its specific flaws and accidents and human touches, could never be made again. She set it on her shelf, not for sale, just to look at. The next day, a customer came to the workshop, a tea master from the capital who had purchased Fumiko's bowls for years. "Show me your new work," he said. Fumiko brought out her usual pieces, perfect and symmetrical. But the tea master's eyes drifted past them to the crooked bowl on the shelf. "That one," he said. "May I see that one?" "Oh, that's not for sale," Fumiko said quickly. "It's flawed." "I was just experimenting." "Please," the tea master insisted. Reluctantly, Fumiko brought down the crooked bowl. The tea master held it, and his face transformed. He turned it slowly, examining every imperfection with what looked like delight. "This," he said softly, "is the first piece of yours that has made me feel something. Your other bowls are impressive. They showcase your skill. But this bowl has wabi-sabi." Wabi-sabi? Fumiko had heard the term, but never fully understood it. "The beauty of imperfection," the tea master explained. "The aesthetic of the impermanent, the incomplete, the imperfect. In tea ceremony, we value this quality above all others. A perfect bowl is cold. It intimidates. It makes you afraid to use it, afraid to break it. But a bowl like this... He cradled the crooked bowl gently. This invites you to hold it, to use it, to accept its nature and your own nature as equally flawed and equally beautiful. He looked at Fumiko seriously. I will pay you 10 times your usual price for this bowl, and I hope you will make more like it. Fumiko found herself saying no. She couldn't explain why, but she wasn't ready to sell that bowl. It had taught her something she was still learning. Over the following months, Fumiko began to experiment with allowing imperfection. Not sloppiness, she still worked with care and skill, but she stopped trying to control every variable. She let the clay speak. She let the fire decide some things. She let her own humanity show in the work. Some pieces came out more crooked than others. Some were more symmetrical. No two were alike. And all of them had something her perfect bowls had never had. They had soul. They had presence. They revealed the person who made them. Her old customers were confused at first. Some stopped coming, wanting only the perfection they had come to expect. But new customers arrived, people who understood wabi-sabi, who valued authenticity over perfection, who wanted to hold a bowl that felt alive rather than ideal. One day, years later, a young potter came to Fumiko's workshop seeking to apprentice. The young woman looked around at the various bowls and asked the question Fumiko had once silently asked herself. Which of these is your best work? Fumiko picked up a bowl that leaned noticeably to one side, its glaze running in unexpected rivulets, a clear fingerprint visible in the clay. This one, she said, not because it's most technically accomplished, but because it's most true. See this wobble? I made this bowl on a day when I was sad about something I can no longer remember. My hands were unsteady, and the clay recorded that unsteadiness. This isn't a flaw. It's a diary entry in clay. It's proof that I was alive, was feeling something, was human when I made it. She set the bowl down gently. For years, I made perfect bowls that could have been made by anyone with sufficient skill. But these imperfect bowls? These could only have been made by me, on these specific days, in these specific moments. The crooked bowls are my truest work because they hide nothing. They reveal everything, my moods, my doubts, my humanity, and in doing so, they give others permission to accept their own imperfection too. The young potter picked up the crooked bowl, feeling its uneven weight, seeing her own reflection distorted in its irregular glaze. So, you're saying, she began slowly, that the goal isn't perfection. The goal is presence, Fumiko replied. When you're trying to be perfect, you're not really there. You're thinking about what you should be doing, what the result should look like, whether you're succeeding or failing. But when you let go of perfection and just engage fully with the material, with the process, with the moment, that's when you make something real. That's when your work becomes art instead of just craft. She smiled, remembering her father's perfect bowls, understanding now why she had needed to move beyond them. Perfection is impressive, but imperfection is honest. And in the end, honesty is more beautiful than perfection could ever be. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own crooked bowls, the parts of yourself you've been trying to perfect, to fix, to hide. What if those imperfections aren't flaws to be corrected, but signatures to be accepted? What if the wobble in your voice, the unevenness of your journey, the visible marks of your struggles are not evidence of failure, but proof of authentic living? You are not a machine-made bowl, smooth and perfect and identical to 1,000 others. You are handmade, unique, bearing the clear imprint of everything you've experienced. Your imperfections tell your story. They make you irreplaceable. Rest now in your own crooked beauty. Let yourself be imperfect, incomplete, impermanent. Let yourself be human. This is not a flaw in your design. This is the design itself, and it's more beautiful than perfection could ever be. The path of Zen unfolds like morning mist, soft and patient. In this next tale, we are invited to see, beyond appearance, into essence. Listen carefully to the next story. In a city famous for its artists, there was a renowned sculptor named Kaori who had created magnificent works for temples, palaces, and public squares throughout the land. She was known for her perfectionism, her unwillingness to declare any work complete until every detail was exactly right. At age 60, Kaori received a commission that she knew would be her masterpiece, a memorial sculpture for the city's founder. She had complete artistic freedom and unlimited time. This would be her legacy, the work by which all her other work would be judged. She began with intense focus, creating preliminary sketches, building models, and selecting the perfect stone. The first year was spent in planning. The second year is spent roughing out the basic form. By the third year, the sculpture was recognizably taking shape as a figure of dignity and strength, capturing something essential about leadership and vision. But as the sculpture neared completion, something strange happened. Kaori couldn't finish it. Every time she thought she was done, she would see another adjustment to make, another detail to refine, another element that wasn't quite right. The nose could be more precise, the hands could be more expressive, the drapery could flow more naturally. Years passed. The sculpture stood in her studio, nearly complete, but never quite complete enough. City officials would visit, would ask when they might see the finished work, and Kaori would assure them it was almost ready, just a few more refinements needed. 10 years after beginning the project, Kaori was still working on the same sculpture. It had gone through countless iterations. Areas she had refined years earlier, she would redo, claiming her skills had improved, and she could do better now. The sculpture had become an obsession, a project that consumed her life but never reached completion. A young sculptor named Isamu, who admired Kaori's earlier work, came to apprentice with her. He expected to learn from watching a master complete her masterpiece. Instead, he found an old woman trapped in endless refinement, unable to stop working on a sculpture that had been nearly done for years. "Why don't you declare it finished?" Isamu finally asked, after watching Kaori rework the same hand for the third time since he arrived. "Because it's not perfect yet," Kaori replied. "I can see the ideal form in my mind. This stone version still falls short. I need to keep working until the stone matches the vision." "But will it ever match?" Isamu asked gently. "Will the real sculpture ever match the perfect one in your imagination?" Kaori had no answer. She had never asked herself this question. She had always assumed that with enough work, enough refinement, enough time, She could make the physical sculpture match her mental ideal. A Zen teacher named Etsuko, who had known Kaori for decades, visited the studio. She looked at the nearly complete sculpture with a sad expression. "You're destroying it," Etsuko said. "I'm perfecting it," Kaori protested. "No, you're overworking it. The sculpture lost its life years ago when you couldn't stop refining it. Now it's becoming tight, over-controlled, anxious. I can see your perfectionism in every surface. The early spontaneity is gone, replaced by compulsive detail." She touched the sculpture gently. Completion doesn't mean achieving perfection. It means recognizing when continuing diminishes rather than improves. This sculpture was probably finished 5 years ago, but you couldn't see it because you were comparing it to an impossible ideal rather than accepting it as the real thing it actually was. Kaori wanted to argue, but she knew Etsuko was right. She looked at her sculpture with honest eyes for the first time in years. It was beautiful in parts, overworked in others. The areas she had refined most recently were actually worse than earlier versions. Too controlled, too fussy, too perfect. The sculpture had lost its breath somewhere along the way. "How do I know when something is done?" Kaori asked quietly. "How do I distinguish between stopping because it's complete and stopping because I've given up?" "You feel it," Etsuko replied. "True completion has a quality of rightness, even if the work isn't perfect. Giving up has a quality of defeat. But what you're doing now is neither completion nor giving up. It's compulsive continuation, working past the point where work helps. That's different from both completion and abandonment." She looked at Kaori directly. "The sculpture should have been installed in the city square years ago, where people would appreciate it. Instead, it's trapped in your studio, being endlessly refined toward an ideal it will never reach. You're preventing it from serving its purpose because you can't accept that it's good enough. That's not dedication to excellence. That's fear disguised as perfectionism." This truth landed hard. Kaori realized she had been afraid to finish the sculpture, afraid to have it judged, afraid it wouldn't live up to her reputation. As long as it remained unfinished in her studio, it remained perfect in potential. Once completed and installed, it would be real, subject to criticism, limited by its actual qualities rather than protected by its imagined ones. "I've been hiding," Kaori admitted, "calling it refinement when actually it was avoidance." With Etsuko's help, Kaori looked at the sculpture one more time and made a decision. She declared it complete as it was, not perfect, but real. She stopped working on it and arranged for its installation. When the sculpture was finally revealed in the city square, public response was mixed. Some people loved it. Others thought it was good, but not as exceptional as they'd expected from a decade of work. Critics noted both its strengths and its weaknesses. It was not a perfect masterpiece. It was a good sculpture with both beautiful passages and overworked areas, a real work rather than an ideal one. And Kaori found unexpected peace in this. The sculpture was done, installed, serving its purpose. It wasn't perfect, but it was complete. It had moved from endless potential to limited actuality, and this movement was itself a kind of perfection. Not the perfection of flawless execution, but the perfection of genuine completion. "I spent 10 years trying to make it perfect," Kaori told Isamu, standing together, looking at the installed sculpture. I should have spent 3 years making it good and then accepted that good was enough. The extra 7 years didn't make it better. They just delayed it. Isamu asked, "But how will you know with your next work? How will you know when to stop?" "I'll try to recognize when I'm working from love versus working from fear," Kaori said. "When I'm working from love, I'm responding to the actual piece, helping it become itself. When I'm working from fear, I'm trying to make it match an impossible ideal, trying to protect myself from criticism or judgment. The work from fear doesn't improve the piece. It just makes it tighter, more controlled, more dead." She touched a rough area of the sculpture that she had always intended to smooth further. "See this? For years I planned to refine it, but now I see it gives texture, life, contrast. My perfectionism wanted to eliminate it, but actually it's one of the better parts. Sometimes what we think is incomplete is actually just real, and real includes roughness, includes elements that don't match the ideal." In her remaining years, Kaori created several more sculptures, and each one she completed more quickly than the last. She learned to recognize the moment when a work was done, not perfect, but complete. She learned that completion meant allowing the work to be what it actually was, rather than endlessly pushing it toward what it might ideally be. "My final work taught me that sometimes completion means stopping, not finishing," she told students. "Sometimes good enough is actually excellent, because continuing would diminish rather than improve. Sometimes the work is done when you can let it go, not when it's perfect." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what in your life needs completion rather than more refinement. What projects, relationships, phases, identities have you been endlessly working on, unable to declare them finished because they don't match your ideal? What would it mean to accept them as complete, as good enough, as done? Completion doesn't require perfection. It requires recognition that continuing is no longer serving the work or serving you. It requires courage to let the real thing exist, rather than protecting the imagined perfect thing by keeping it perpetually incomplete. Rest now in completion. Let yourself be done with some things, not because they're perfect, but because they're finished. Let yourself stop refining and start living with what actually is, rather than what might ideally be. The sculptor's final work teaches that holding on too long destroys as surely as letting go too early. Learn to recognize the difference. And then, when it's time, let go. There was a monk named Ryusei who lived simply in a small temple at the edge of a town. He owned very little, just what was necessary for his practice and daily life. Among his few possessions was a pair of sturdy sandals he had received as a gift from his teacher when he first became a monk. They were well made, comfortable, and had served him faithfully for 7 years. One morning, Ryusei woke to discover his sandals were gone. Someone had stolen them during the night. He stood at the temple entrance, looking at the empty space where his shoes had been, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Anger at the theft, worry about how he would afford new sandals on no income, sadness at losing a gift from his beloved teacher, attachment to these particular shoes that had carried him so many miles. As he stood there, a neighbor passed by and noticed his bare feet. "Ryusei-san, where are your shoes?" "Someone took them during the night," Ryusei replied. "What?" That's terrible. You should report it to the magistrate. We can't have thieves in this neighborhood. But Ryusei shook his head slowly. No need to involve the magistrate. But you need shoes! And the thief needs to be punished. Ryusei was quiet for a moment, watching the morning light spread across the ground. Then he said something that puzzled the neighbor. I hope they fit him well. The night was cold. Perhaps his need for shoes was greater than mine. The neighbor went away confused, but Ryusei meant what he said. As he sat with his initial reactions of anger and loss, he began to examine them more carefully. Why was he so upset? Because someone had taken something that belonged to him. But had it really belonged to him? He hadn't made the sandals himself. They had been given to him by his teacher, who had received them from someone else, who had purchased them from a craftsman who made them from materials that came from plants and animals, which came from the earth. At what point in this chain had the sandals become his? He had been using them, yes, they had been in his possession. But possession is temporary, always. Whether stolen, worn out, or outlived by his own death, those sandals were never going to be his permanently. They were just passing through his life for a time, and now they had passed on to someone else. This understanding brought a strange peace. Instead of focusing on what he had lost, Ryusei found himself thinking about the person who had taken the shoes. What desperation drives someone to steal shoes from a poor monk? What circumstances had brought them to this temple in the middle of the night, in need of footwear? Ryusei spent the day walking barefoot, which he hadn't done since childhood. He noticed things he never noticed while wearing shoes. The texture of different surfaces beneath his feet. The temperature of stones that had been in sun versus shade. The careful attention required to avoid sharp objects. The humility of going barefoot while others wore shoes. That evening, another monk from a neighboring temple visited. Hearing about the stolen sandals, he immediately offered Ryusei a spare pair he had. Ryusei accepted gratefully, but he noticed something. If he had spent the whole day angry about the theft, bitter about his loss, he would have missed the insights that came from walking barefoot. He would have missed the kindness of this monk's offering. He would have poisoned his whole day with resentment over something that was already gone and couldn't be changed. Instead, by letting go of attachment to the stolen shoes, by wishing well for the thief, by being present to what actually was rather than resenting what was no longer, he had passed the day in relative peace. A student who heard this story asked Ryusei, "But master, didn't you feel angry? Isn't anger at injustice natural?" "Of course I felt angry," Ryusei replied. "For about 10 minutes, anger arose, just as it arises for anyone when something is taken from them. But then I had a choice. I could feed that anger, nurture it, build stories around it, carry it with me all day, letting it poison my mind and disturb my peace. Or I could acknowledge it, let it pass, and choose a different relationship with what had happened." "But the thief should be punished," the student insisted. "What he did was wrong." "Perhaps he will be punished by his own conscience," Ryusei said. "Perhaps he is punished already by whatever circumstances drove him to steal from a poor monk. But whether he is punished or not is not my concern. My concern is whether I will punish myself by holding resentment or free myself by letting go." He looked at his new sandals, the gift from his fellow monk. These shoes came to me because those shoes left me. If I had been so attached to the old shoes that I refused to accept new ones, I would still be barefoot. Life is constantly taking things from us and giving things to us. We suffer when we cling too tightly to what's being taken, and when we refuse to receive what's being offered. The student was quiet, thinking about this teaching. Finally, he asked, "So you're saying we shouldn't care about our possessions? We should just let people take whatever they want?" "I'm saying we should hold our possessions lightly," Ryusei replied. "Use them while we have them, appreciate them, but know that we never truly own anything. Everything we think we possess is just temporarily in our care. When it leaves us, whether through loss or theft or natural decay, we can let it go without adding the suffering of clinging to the simple fact of its absence." He smiled, remembering the cold night when his shoes were taken. "That thief taught me something valuable. He showed me how attached I was to those sandals, how much of my sense of security was tied to possessions. He gave me an opportunity to practice letting go. In a way, though it wasn't his intention, he gave me a gift even as he took something from me." Years later, Ryusei would tell people, "The shoes I lost mattered less than what I learned by losing them. The thief took my sandals, but gave me a teaching about non-attachment. Most of what we think we own, we don't. Most of what we think we need, we don't. And most of what we think would destroy us to lose, we can actually live without quite peacefully." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what you're holding too tightly. What possessions, what relationships, what ideas, what version of yourself are you clinging to, fearing their loss? What if you held these things the way Ryusei learned to hold his sandals? With appreciation while they're present, with acceptance when they leave. Nothing you possess is truly yours to keep. Everything is temporary, passing through your life for a time. This doesn't mean you can't enjoy these things or care for them. It means you don't have to suffer when they inevitably pass on. Rest now in empty hands, knowing that holding loosely allows life to flow through your grasp. What needs to stay will stay. What needs to go will go. And you can be at peace either way, not because you don't care, but because you understand that ownership was always an illusion and loss was always inevitable. Let go tonight of everything you've been trying so hard to hold onto, and notice how light your hands feel when they're finally open. In the hush of understanding, Zen offers us another glimpse of what it means to recognize worth not by weight or shine, but by presence. Here starts the next story. In a village where bread was the staple food, there lived a baker named Tomoe, who had learned the craft from her mother and grandmother. She took great pride in her work, waking before dawn each day to prepare dough, tend the oven, and produce loaves that the village depended on. Tomoe had baked thousands of loaves over the years, and she rarely made mistakes anymore. Her hands knew the feel of properly kneaded dough. Her eyes could judge oven temperature by the color of the fire. Her timing was precise. Day after day, she produced bread that was consistently good, reliable, exactly what people expected. But one morning, something went wrong. A neighbor had stopped by to talk just as Tomoe was loading loaves into the oven. Distracted by the conversation, she forgot about the bread. By the time she remembered, smoke was pouring from the oven. She pulled out loaf after loaf of burnt bread, each one blackened and ruined. Tomo was devastated. In 15 years of baking, she had never destroyed an entire day's batch. The waste of ingredients troubled her. The loss of income for the day worried her, but most of all, her pride was wounded. She had been perfect for so long, and now she had failed in the most basic way. She sat among the burnt loaves, feeling terrible. Her young apprentice, a girl named Kiku, came in and saw the disaster. "What happened?" Kiku asked. "I forgot," Tomo said miserably. "I was distracted and I forgot. After 15 years of baking, I made a beginner's mistake." Kiku picked up one of the burnt loaves, examining it. "So this is what happens when bread stays in the oven too long." "Yes, it's completely ruined. Worthless." But Kiku was looking at it with fascination. She had been apprenticing for 6 months and had never seen burnt bread before. Tomo was so skilled that mistakes never happened in her presence. "How much too long was it in there?" Kiku asked. Tomoe thought. "Perhaps 10 minutes passed when I should have removed it." And what if it had been 5 minutes too long instead of 10? Tomoe considered this. She had actually never experimented with deliberately over-baking bread, so she wasn't certain. "I suppose it would be burnt, but less severely. Could it still be eaten if it were only 5 minutes over?" "Perhaps if you cut away the worst parts." Kiku set down the burnt loaf and picked up another. "And this one is burnt differently than that one. Why?" Tomo looked more carefully at the loaves she had been too upset to really examine. Kiku was right. They had been in different parts of the oven, so they had burnt in different ways. Some were charred uniformly. Others were only burnt on one side. Some had burnt crusts but soft interiors. Each loaf told a story about where it had been in the oven and how fire had affected it. "I've been baking for 6 months, Kiku said, "and I've only learned how to do things right. I've never learned what happens when things go wrong, but you just learned more in one mistake than I've learned in weeks of getting it right." Tomo looked at her young apprentice with new appreciation. The girl had wisdom beyond her years. "You're right," Tomo said slowly. "I've been so focused on perfection that I've stopped learning. Every loaf I bake comes out the same. I'm not growing or discovering anything new. I'm just repeating what I already know how to do." She stood up and examined the burnt loaves more systematically. "This one," she said, pointing, "was at the back of the oven where it's hottest. It burnt fastest. These along the side got less direct heat. They took longer to burn. And this one right in front, it actually caught fire briefly before I pulled it out." Kiku watched her teacher transform from defeated to curious, from ashamed to engaged. "You know what?" Tomo said. "I'm going to deliberately burn some bread. Different amounts, different positions in the oven, different types of dough. I'm going to learn what I don't know because I've been too careful to ever make these mistakes." Over the following weeks, Tomo conducted experiments that would have horrified her former perfectionist self. She deliberately overbaked loaves to see what happened. She underbaked some. She tried different temperatures, different positions in the oven, different lengths of time. She made every mistake she could think of, carefully observing the results. What she learned transformed her baking. she discovered that what she had called perfect was actually just one point on a spectrum of possibilities. She found that slightly underbaked bread had a chewier texture that some people preferred. She learned that bread with a darker crust had a richer flavor. She discovered techniques she never would have tried if she hadn't been forced out of her perfect routine by that first mistake. Her bread became more varied, more interesting, more responsive to what different customers wanted. People who had been eating her consistently good bread for years suddenly found themselves excited by it again. "What changed?" they would ask. "Your bread seems different lately." Tomo would smile and say, "I finally made a mistake. And that mistake taught me more than years of getting it right." One day, a traveling baker who was considered a master of the craft stopped at Tomo's shop. He tasted her bread and was impressed. "You understand bread deeply," he said. "How did you learn so much?" "I burnt a whole day's batch," Tomo replied, "and instead of just feeling bad about it, I decided to learn from it. That mistake opened doors I didn't even know existed." The master baker nodded knowingly. The problem with being good at something is that you stop making mistakes. And when you stop making mistakes, you stop learning. You just keep repeating what you already know. It's the mistakes, if you pay attention to them, that show you what you don't yet understand. He looked around at her thriving shop. People think mastery means never making mistakes, but real mastery comes from making mistakes consciously, learning from them, and letting them teach you what success never can. Years later, when Kiku had become a skilled baker herself and taken over Tomo's shop, she would tell new apprentices about the day of the burnt bread. "My teacher was perfect for 15 years, she would say, and in those 15 years, her skill barely grew. But one mistake, one moment of failure, opened up years of new learning. Don't fear mistakes. Pay attention to them. They're often more valuable teachers than success." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own burnt bread, the mistakes you've made, the failures you've experienced, the times things went wrong. Are you still punishing yourself for these mistakes? Still seeing them only as evidence of inadequacy? What if those mistakes were actually your best teachers? What if failure, when you pay attention to it, reveals possibilities that success keeps hidden? What if the things you did wrong showed you more than all the things you did right? You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to get everything right. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is make a mistake, pay attention to what happens, and let it teach you what you couldn't learn any other way. Rest now in acceptance of your imperfect humanity. Your mistakes are not failures. They're experiments. They're lessons. They're the burnt bread that teaches you something new about the oven of your own life. Let them nourish your wisdom instead of poisoning your peace. As the lantern of awareness glows a little brighter, we come to a tale about seeing with more than the eyes. Let the stillness guide you now, and listen carefully to the next story.